I don't care what her file says. I care what I see standing in front of me right now, and what I see is a mistake. Commander Ethan Walker said it loud enough for every man in that briefing room to hear. He wanted them to hear it. I was looking directly at Lieutenant Ava Bennett when the words left his mouth. This 25-year-old woman who had just told him calmly and without apology that his entire mission plan was walking 11 men into a prepared kill zone. She didn't look away. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "Then let me show you what your mistake just saved you from." The file landed on the table with enough force to scatter 2 coffee cups and a stack of mission briefings. Nobody moved to pick anything up. Commander Ethan Walker stood at the head of the room with his arms crossed and an expression that had taken 15 years of combat deployments to build, the expression of a man who believed with complete certainty that he already knew everything worth knowing about the situation in front of him. He had submitted his personnel request 4 days ago. 1 sentence. 8 words. Requesting most experienced long-range precision operator available. What command sent back was not what he asked for. The door to the briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Base Iron Valley opened at 0540, and Lieutenant Ava Bennett walked through it, carrying nothing but a rifle case, a small mission bag, and an expression so calm it bordered on unsettling. She was 25 years old. She stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight knot, and eyes that moved across the room the way a surveyor's instrument moved across a terrain map, methodical, precise, recording everything. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't look for approval. She simply found an open space along the wall, set the rifle case down with deliberate care, and waited. Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his senior chief, Marcus Reed, who was standing near the window with a coffee mug halfway to his mouth. Then Walker laughed. It wasn't a small laugh. It wasn't polite. It filled the room the way his voice always filled rooms, completely leaving no space for anything else. "I asked for a sniper," he said. "Not someone who still needs to prove she belongs here." The other operators shifted. Some smiled. Some exchanged glances with the careful, practiced subtlety of men who understood exactly what their commander wanted to see. Senior Chief Reed set his coffee mug down slowly. Petty Officer First Class Danny Kowalski, who had been running combat operations for 9 years and believed he had an instinct for reading. People looked at Ava Bennett the way you look at something that has arrived in the wrong location. Ava said nothing. She had heard variations of that laugh her entire career. Different rooms, different commanders, same laugh. The laugh was never really about her. The laugh was about what she represented, the disruption of an assumption so deep and so old that most of the men who held it couldn't even identify it as an assumption. They just called it instinct. They called it experience. They called it knowing how these things worked. She had learned something important about that laugh early in her career. You didn't fight it. You didn't argue with it. You let it run its course, and then you let the work do the talking, because the work never lied, and the work didn't care what anyone assumed. Her father had told her that. Retired Marine Master Sergeant William Bennett, who had spent 22 years as a long-range precision operator before his left knee gave out on a training exercise in the Mojave, and the Corps sent him home with a handshake and a disability rating. He had taught Ava to shoot when she was 9 years old. Not because he was trying to build a warrior, because she had asked him to. Because she had sat beside him in the backyard of their house in Oceanside and watched him clean his service rifle with a quiet patience that seemed to her at 9 years old like the most serious and beautiful thing she had ever witnessed, and she had told him she wanted to understand what he understood. He had looked at her for a long time. Then he had said, "The best shooters I ever knew weren't the loudest people in the room. They were the ones who stayed invisible until the exact moment they were needed." She had been carrying that sentence for 16 years. Walker pulled a chair out at the head of the table and dropped into it, still smiling with the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously wrong about anything in a very long time. He opened the mission file and spread the satellite photographs across the table with one sweep of his hand. "Since Command has decided to send us what they sent us," he said, and the pronoun landed with exactly the weight he intended it to land with, "we'll make it work, Lieutenant Bennett." He said her name like a formality. "Overwatch. Standard protocol. You maintain a position 2 miles northeast of the target facility. You observe, you report, and you engage if we're in contact, and you have a clear line. That's all." Ava moved to the table. She didn't ask permission. She simply stepped forward and looked at the satellite photographs and the stillness with which she did it. The total absence of performance. The complete absorption was different enough from everything else in the room that two of the operators stopped what they were doing and watched her without meaning to. She looked at the images for 40 seconds. Nobody spoke. "Sir?" Her voice was level. "May I ask a question about the approach route?" Walker gestured at the photographs without looking up from his own copy. "Ask." "The northern ridge line." She pointed to a section of terrain that ran along the upper margin of the satellite image. "These vehicle tracks, they're from two different tire patterns. The deeper impressions are from something heavier than a standard transport vehicle." Walker looked at the section she was pointing to. "Support vehicle, supply run. Intel has them documented." "The impressions are fresh," Ava said. "The soil disruption along the edges hasn't compressed. That happened in the last 12 to 18 hours, not during a supply run 4 days ago." Silence. Walker looked at Senior Chief Reed. Reed shrugged slightly. A non-committal shrug. The shrug of a man who respected his commander enough not to agree with someone his commander was already dismissing. "Lieutenant," Walker said, and his voice had shifted not louder, but harder, the way a door sounds when someone pushes it closed with more force than the situation requires. "You have been in this room for approximately 7 minutes. I've been running operations in this region for 3 years. Intel has analyzed those images with assets you don't have access to, and they have assessed the approach route as viable. So unless you have something beyond a feeling about tire tracks, I suggest you familiarize yourself with the mission parameters and prepare your equipment." He returned to his file. Ava looked at the photographs for another 2 seconds. Then she straightened, nodded once, said, "Understood, sir," and stepped back to her position along the wall. But she didn't stop looking at the photographs. While Walker ran the briefing approach vectors, exfil route timing communication protocols, she kept her gaze on the satellite images she had already memorized, and her mind kept returning to the same collection of small details that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. The tire tracks. A section of disturbed ground along the eastern approach that was slightly too uniform to be natural erosion. 3 positions along the northern ridgeline, where the terrain offered perfect concealment for someone who understood angles of fire. And one thing that Walker hadn't addressed, hadn't noticed, had probably looked at and processed as background the way experienced operators sometimes stopped seeing things that didn't fit the shape of what they expected. The facility itself showed no light discipline violations in the last 72 hours of imagery. No personnel movement outside the documented patrol schedule. No deviations from the pattern intelligence had established over 6 weeks of observation. Ava had spent enough time studying ambush methodology to know what that kind of perfection meant. It didn't mean the enemy was operating normally. It meant they were performing normal. There was a difference, and the difference was the kind that got people killed. She didn't bring it up again before the briefing ended, because Walker had already told her exactly where the ceiling was, and she understood that pressing him now in front of his team before the mission had given her anything beyond inference would accomplish nothing except harden his position and eliminate any chance he would listen to her when it mattered. She had learned that lesson the hard way early in her career when she had pushed too hard too fast and watched a commander dig into his position the way men dig into fighting holes. Deeper and deeper until the position became more important than the truth of what the position was defending. So she waited. She would have a better argument in 12 hours. The question was whether 12 hours would be soon enough. The team rolled out at 0200. Iron Valley's mountain terrain was the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the surface of your skin. It found the gaps in your gear and settled into the spaces between things, patient and thorough. Ava had operated in worse. She had been trained to manage the cold the way her father had taught her to manage everything else that wanted to distract her from the task. Acknowledge it, catalog it, set it aside, continue. She moved to her observation position alone. This was standard. A sniper operating Overwatch doesn't travel with the assault element. The separation isn't just tactical, it's psychological. The sniper's job requires a different quality of attention from the ground team's job. They needed speed and momentum and collective cohesion. She needed stillness and patience, and the particular kind of solitary focus that most people couldn't sustain for more than a few minutes before their mind began to drift toward comfort. She reached her position on the northeast ridgeline at 0347, 2 miles from the target facility, approximately 300-400 meters. At that distance in mountain terrain with the wind patterns she had assessed from the meteorological data available in the mission packet, a shot was possible but required significant calculation. Not the hardest shot she had ever made. Not close. She established her position, checked her equipment, with the systematic thoroughness that had become as natural as breathing, and settled her eye to her scope. The facility appeared in her reticle, and she began to watch. This was the part of her work that no one who hadn't done it could fully understand. The watching. The extended disciplined attention that had to remain sharp and present across hours without a target, without feedback, without confirmation that anything you were doing was useful. Most people experienced stillness as absence, the absence of activity, the absence of input, the absence of progress. Ava experienced it differently. Stillness was where information lived. Stillness was where the terrain revealed what it was hiding, because the things that were hiding something could not stay perfectly still forever. Eventually, everything moved. The question was whether you were paying the right kind of attention when it did. 40 minutes after she established her position, she saw the first thing. A branch. On the eastern approach, approximately 800 meters from the facility perimeter, at a point where the terrain funneled movement toward a natural choke point. A branch on a low scrub tree was bent at an angle that didn't match the wind direction. Branches bent by wind bent along a consistent axis. This one was bent across the grain of the current wind, which meant something had pushed against it, and the branch hadn't fully sprung back. Something had moved through that location within the last 4 to 6 hours. Something large enough to bend a branch that size. She noted it, kept watching. 11 minutes later, she found the second thing. A rock formation along the northern approach. A natural cluster of boulders that the mission briefing had identified as a potential cover position for the assault element during the final approach had a dark area at its base that wasn't consistent with shadow. It was too localized, too specific. It had the shape and depth of an area where multiple people had been sitting or crouching for an extended period, compressing the ground, disturbing the surface moisture pattern. Someone had been there, recently. She keyed her radio. Overwatch to actual. I have potential activity at Echo 7 and November 4. Recommend slowing approach and conducting additional observation before crossing the 400-meter threshold. Walker's voice came back within 10 seconds. Flat. Controlled. The voice of a man who had already made his decision and was managing an interruption. Copy Overwatch. Assess and continue reporting. Ground element maintaining current pace. She lowered the radio. He wasn't stopping. She had expected that. She had not expected him to stop based on 2 data points. She needed more. She needed something that couldn't be explained away as natural terrain variation or misread shadow. She kept watching. And 6 minutes later, she found the third thing. And the third thing changed everything. The vehicle track. Not the tracks Walker had dismissed in the briefing room. New tracks. Parallel to the approach route. The assault element was currently moving along, running inside the natural low ground that the team's route skirted, but didn't cross a position that put them invisible from the approach angle, but within 50 meters of the assault element's intended path. These tracks hadn't been in the satellite imagery. They were too recent. They had been made after the last satellite pass, which meant after the mission had already been assessed and approved. Which meant whoever made them knew the assessment window and worked within it deliberately. Ava's hands were very still. This was not an ambush of opportunity. This was not an enemy force reacting to an incursion they had detected. This was a prepared position. This was a carefully constructed kill zone using operational security protocols that required intelligence, not just proximity. Intelligence, not just pattern observation, but specific intelligence about this operation, this timeline, this approach route. Which meant one of two things. Either the enemy had significantly more sophisticated collection capability than the mission assessment had accounted for, or someone had told them. Overwatch to actual. Stop the advance. Repeat, stop the advance. Her voice was level, but she had abandoned the careful protocol of her previous transmission. This was not a suggestion framed as a question. There are vehicle tracks running parallel to your current route on the western low ground. Post-imagery. They are post-imagery actual. This position was prepared after our last collection window. Silence on the radio. 3 seconds. 5. Overwatch. Walker's voice had changed slightly. Not enough to confirm that he was taking her seriously. Enough to confirm that he had heard the word she had used. Post-imagery. How confident are you in that assessment? Completely confident in the tracks. Working a hypothesis on the timing. But the tracks are real, and they weren't there 48 hours ago. Another silence. Petty Officer Kowalski. Walker's voice on the team channel now. Western low ground bearing 285. Can you see it from your current position? Kowalski's voice slightly breathless from movement. Negative, Commander. Low ground is below my sight line from here. Elements. Hold current position. I'm assessing. Ava let out a controlled breath. He had stopped them. Not because he trusted her judgment. She could hear in his voice that he still hadn't made that turn. He had stopped them because the word post-imagery had landed somewhere in his operational instinct, the part of him that had stayed alive for 15 years of combat operations. And that part of him had recognized the gravity of what post-imagery meant, even if the rest of him was still resistant to the source. She kept her eye on the terrain, and then, in the stillness of the pre-dawn mountain air, she saw the fourth thing. And the fourth thing was not a branch or a rock formation or a vehicle track. The fourth thing was a person. How was good? Whoever he was very, very good. He was positioned along the ridgeline approximately 400 meters north of the assault element's current hold position, in a natural depression, between two large rocks that created a profile so consistent with the terrain, that in low light without a thermal optic, most observers would have passed over him 3 times before registering that the shape was wrong. But Ava had been watching this ridgeline for nearly 2 hours. She had cataloged the terrain in enough detail that her visual memory of it was essentially photographic, and the shape between the rocks had not been there 40 minutes ago. He had moved into position in the last 40 minutes. He was carrying a long rifle, and he was not looking at the facility. He was looking at the approach route. He was looking at exactly the location where the assault element was currently holding. Ava's heart rate stayed level. This was another thing her father had taught her, and this was the thing that separated the operators who could actually perform under pressure from the operators who believed they could. When the moment arrived, the real moment, not the rehearsed moment, not the training range moment, but the moment when the information in your scope was real, and the consequences of your next action were real, your body would try to override your training. Your heart rate would try to climb. Your breathing would try to shorten. Your hands would try to tighten around the rifle in a grip that would destroy the shot before you took it. You did not fight the body's response. You acknowledged it. You processed it. And you continued. Actual. Her voice was absolutely steady. I have a hostile sniper on the ridgeline. He's in overwatch of your current position. You are being ranged. She heard Walker's sharp intake of breath over the radio. Where northern ridge, bearing 02 from your current position, 400 meters. He's in a depression between 2 large rock formations. He is oriented toward your element. Can you take the shot? Not from my current position. Angle is wrong. I need to reposition. Give me 4 minutes. You have 3. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. Repositioning under time pressure in mountain terrain while maintaining noise discipline was an exercise that most people understood conceptually and almost nobody understood physically until they had done it under real conditions. The terrain wanted to make noise. Every loose stone, every compressed vegetation, every shift of weight across uneven ground created a signature that could travel in mountain air with startling clarity. You moved slowly enough to control each contact with the surface. You moved quickly enough to meet your timeline. You reconciled those two contradictory imperatives through technique that had been built through thousands of hours of repetition until it was no longer conscious. Ava reached her second position in 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She settled the rifle, found the depression in her reticle. The hostile sniper had not moved. He was still ranged on the assault element's position, which told her he had either not detected her movement or had detected it and was waiting to see what developed. Either way, he was still in the depression. Either way, he was still presenting a target. She ran the calculation. Distance 380 meters. Wind 7 kilometers per hour from the northwest slight crosswind component. Elevation. She was above him by approximately 30 meters, which affected the bullet's drop trajectory in a way that required a minor downward compensation. Temperature cold enough to increase air density and affect velocity slightly. She made the adjustments. She controlled her breathing. She watched him for 10 seconds. He moved his head. She was ready for it. The movement told her the precise position of his vitals relative to the rock formation that was partially concealing him. She had her window. She fired. The shot broke cleanly. The depression between the rocks went still. "Hostile sniper is down," she reported. "Northern ridge is clear." A full second of radio silence. Then Walker's voice came back. And something had changed in it. Something small, but unmistakable. The slight contraction of a man who has just received information that has shifted the ground under him, and who is too experienced to pretend it hasn't. Elements. His voice steady and commanding, but carrying that subtle, altered quality. "Hold position. I'm conducting an assessment before we continue." He was starting to listen, but the assessment was already showing Ava something worse than what she had reported. Because the hostile sniper on the ridgeline had not been operating alone. He had been communicating with someone. And the radio traffic she was picking up on the monitoring frequency, fragmented, partially encrypted, but unmistakably active, told her that his elimination had been noted, and that the people who had noted it were now doing something in response. She could not yet see what they were doing. But she could feel the quality of the silence changing on the mountainside in the way that silence changes when the thing that was hidden is beginning to move. She pressed the transmit button. "Actual, I need you to understand something. The sniper wasn't the threat. He was a piece of it. I'm picking up radio traffic on the monitoring frequency, and it spiked in the last 90 seconds. Someone is responding to what just happened. We need to reassess the entire operation before you take another step toward that facility." A longer pause this time. Then Walker's voice, and the thing in it now was unmistakable. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of the consideration that preceded trust, arriving in a man who had built his career on never needing it from people he hadn't already approved of, under conditions that were already more complicated than he had planned for. "Talk to me," he said. And Ava began. She talked him through everything she had seen. Not as a challenge, not as a rebuke. She laid it out the way a surveyor lays out measurements, precise, referenced, sequential, and she let the information build its own case without pushing the conclusion. The branch. The compressed ground at Echo 7. The vehicle tracks. The sniper. The radio traffic. Walker listened. His team was still in hold position, hunkered in the low ground with the cold settling into their gear and the adrenaline from the sniper report still working through their systems. When she finished, Walker said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You saw all of this before we left the wire. The branch and the rock formation, no. I saw those after I established my position. The vehicle tracks, I saw the pattern that worried me in the briefing room. I couldn't confirm the post-imagery timing until I had eyes on the terrain directly." "But you believed the approach was compromised before we stepped off?" "Yes, sir." Another silence. "And you told me that?" "Yes, sir." The silence that followed was longer than the others. Long enough that Senior Chief Reed's voice came over the team channel, quiet and careful. "Commander," Walker's voice came back. "Stand by." Then to Ava. "How bad?" She took a breath. The radio traffic I'm monitoring is consistent with a coordinated response. The facility is the anchor point, but I don't believe the primary threat is inside it. I believe the primary threat is the terrain between your current position and the facility. You walked into the first layer of it when I took out that sniper. There are more layers. How many positions? I don't know yet. I need time to work the ridgelines. But based on what I've already seen, the vehicle tracks the prepared sniper position, the traffic pattern. This wasn't assembled quickly. Someone put time into this. Someone built it knowing our route and our timeline. The word that Walker said next was quiet and sharp, and not intended for the radio, but the transmit button was still pressed. Ava waited. Then Walker said, "Elements. We're conducting a full halt and reassessment. Nobody moves. Kowalski, maintain eyes on the western low ground. Chen, you're on the northern approach. Overwatch." And his voice shifted in the way that a frequency shifts a slight recalibration, a different quality. "I need everything you can give me." "Copy that," Ava said. And she pressed her eye back to the scope. Because somewhere on the mountainside, the thing that had been hiding was still moving, and she was the only person who had any chance of finding it before it found them. The radio traffic spiked again at 0521. She was deep in a long scan of the northern approach terrain when it happened, a sudden surge in transmission frequency that lasted approximately 40 seconds before dropping back to its previous pattern. She had been monitoring the signal on a secondary channel while maintaining her primary focus on the ridgelines, and the spike pulled her attention. 40 seconds of elevated traffic. In a coordinated ambush scenario, that kind of signal pattern typically meant one of three things: an acknowledgement of a changed condition, a coordination of movement between separated elements, or the triggering of a planned sequence that had been waiting for a specific event to begin. She had given them the event: the elimination of their sniper. Actual. Her voice was still level. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it completely before you respond." Walker's voice was clipped and present. "Go." The traffic spike I just observed is consistent with a sequenced ambush being activated. They had a trigger condition. The sniper going offline was the trigger. Whatever they built on this mountain, they built it so that losing that position would initiate the next phase. A beat. So they planned to lose him. They planned for the possibility. A sniper in that position at that location on a known approach route. He wasn't there to stop the operation. I was there to test it. To see if we had Overwatch, to see if Overwatch could range him at that distance, to see what our reaction time was. They got the data they needed. The silence on the radio was the sound of a very experienced man recalculating a situation that was significantly more complex than it had appeared. "Options," Walker said. "Extraction. Pull back to a defensible position outside the facility's extended kill zone and reassess with updated intelligence before committing to a second attempt." The hostage. She knew about the hostage. The reason this mission existed. The reason 11 operators were on a mountain in the cold at 0521, with a situation that was getting worse by the minute. A government contractor. Taken 8 days ago. Last confirmed location, the facility. She also knew something that the ground team didn't know she knew. She had done additional analysis after the briefing, working alone in the space Walker had essentially assigned her by dismissing her early. She had gone back through the imagery, not just the current imagery, but the historical imagery, going back 6 weeks. She had looked at personnel movement patterns, vehicle patterns, the timing and routing of supply runs. And she had found something. The imagery showed consistent movement between the target facility and a secondary structure approximately 1.4 kilometers to the northeast, a building that the mission assessment had categorized as an empty storage structure. But the movement pattern wasn't consistent with equipment transport or supply logistics. The timing was irregular. The vehicle configurations were inconsistent. One type of vehicle transported large equipment. A different type of vehicle, smaller and faster, made the runs to the secondary structure. Ava had built a hypothesis based on that data that she had not yet shared with Walker. Because she was still working the evidence, and sharing an incomplete hypothesis with a commander who had already dismissed her once was a move that required the hypothesis to be airtight before she presented it. She was close, but close was not there. The hostage, she said, may not be in the facility. Another silence, longer than any of the previous ones. Repeat that, Walker said. I have imagery analysis suggesting consistent secondary movement to a structure 1.4 kilometers northeast of the target. Pattern doesn't match supply logistics. It matches personnel transport. I believe the hostage may have been relocated. She could hear it in the silence that followed. The full weight of what she was saying, landing on a man who had built an operation around a location, sent his team into a prepared ambush based on that location, and was now being told by the person he had dismissed in his briefing room that the location might have been wrong from the start. When did you develop this? Walker asked. His voice was absolutely controlled. Dangerously controlled. The control of a man keeping several large and complicated things in balance simultaneously. After the briefing, I went back through the historical imagery. Why didn't you bring it to me before we stepped off? It was a fair question. It was also a complicated one. I didn't have enough confidence in the hypothesis to bring it to you before mission execution. I needed more data to close the inference gap. I was still working it when we stepped off. But you were confident enough in the approach route concerns. The approach route concerns were based on direct observational evidence. The hostage location hypothesis was based on pattern inference. They're different categories of confidence. Walker said nothing. Then, how confident are you now? 70%. I need more time to get to 90. How much time? She looked at the image running through her analysis process in her mind. The movement pattern, the vehicle types, the timing intervals, the weight of each piece of evidence against the weight of alternative explanations. 30 minutes, maybe less. You have 20. Keep talking to me on the ridgelines. She pressed her eye back to the scope, and somewhere on the mountain, the thing that was waiting to move, waited for its moment. And Ava Bennett, who had been laughed at in a briefing room, who had been told she didn't understand a battlefield. She had read better than anyone in that room, who was 2 miles from the nearest friendly position in the cold dark of a mountain that was full of people who wanted her team dead. She kept watching, because the work always proved it. She just needed a little more time. Walker gave her 20 minutes. She used 18, not because she ran out of time. Because the evidence stopped being a hypothesis at the 17-minute mark and became something she could no longer call anything other than certainty. The movement pattern to the secondary structure. The vehicle types. The timing intervals pulled against 6 weeks of historical imagery. The way the facility itself had performed perfect operational discipline for 72 straight hours, not because it was clean, but because it was empty of the thing everyone assumed was inside it. The hostage was not in the facility. She keyed the radio. Actual. I'm at 90%. The secondary structure northeast 1.4 kilometers. That's where he is. A beat. Then Walker's voice clipped and stripped of everything except function. What's your confidence floor? The floor is 85. The ceiling is 93. I won't tell you it's absolute because nothing at this distance ever is. But every data point I have points the same direction, and none of them point toward the facility. Another silence. Longer. Senior Chief Reed's voice came over the team channel, quiet and deliberate. Commander, if she's right and we hit the facility, we lose the hostage. Nobody said anything after that. They didn't need to. The geometry of the situation had just rearranged itself around a single brutal fact, and every operator on that mountain understood what the fact meant. An operation built around a wrong location wasn't just a failed mission. It was a death sentence for the man they had come to bring home. Walker's voice came back. Overwatch, the northeast structure. What's the approach look like from your position? I can't see the structure directly from here. Terrain obscures it. But I can see the ridgeline above it, and the ridgeline is clean. No prepared positions, no movement. Whatever they built on this mountain, they built it pointing at the facility, not at the secondary structure. Because they didn't think we'd look there. Because they didn't think anyone would tell us to. The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence. Walker didn't respond immediately. She could hear the quality of it through the radio, the sound of a man sitting with something that had just cost him something, even if he hadn't paid the full price yet. Then he said, "Elements. New objective. Northeast 1.4 kilometers from current position. We're moving to the secondary structure. Overwatch. I need you repositioned to cover the new approach within—" He stopped, because that was when the mountain opened up. The first burst of fire came from the western ridgeline. It was not aimed at the assault element's current position. It was aimed at the route they would have taken if they had continued toward the facility, the route they had been holding back from for the last 20 minutes while Ava worked her analysis. The burst was heavy sustained and came from at least 3 separate positions, firing in coordination. A machine gun element. Prepared. Pre-sighted. Waiting. They had activated the ambush. Not because the assault element had moved, because they had waited long enough and the silence had told them something was wrong, and they had decided to initiate rather than wait longer and risk losing the setup entirely. Walker's voice cut through the radio immediately. Contact Western Ridgeline. All elements maintain position. Do not move toward the facility. Overwatch. I see them. She was already moving her scope. 3 positions, just as she had counted from the radio traffic pattern. The westernmost position was the command element. She could tell from the communication pattern, the way fire direction seemed to originate from that location and radiate outward. 3 positions, western approach. I'm working left to right. Do it. She fired. The leftmost position went quiet. She was already adjusting for the second. The return fire from the remaining positions shifted slightly. Not toward her. Not yet. They hadn't located her, but the shift told her they had detected the suppression from her direction and were recalibrating. They were good. Better than the briefing's threat assessment had suggested. Which meant the threat assessment had been built on the same assumptions as everything else about this operation. Assumptions that had been wrong from the beginning. She fired again. The second position dropped. The third position was the command element, and the command element did something she hadn't anticipated. Instead of returning fire or relocating it, went silent. Complete radio silence. No transmissions. No movement she could detect. The position that had been the center of the communication pattern simply stopped being readable. Actual. Third position has gone dark. I've lost the command element. Walker's voice was tight. Lost how? No transmission, no movement. Either they've relocated, or they've switched to a different communication protocol. I'm not monitoring. Both options are bad. Why is relocation bad? Less fire is good. Because a command element that relocates in the middle of an initiated ambush isn't retreating. It's repositioning. They're not done. They're adjusting. A sharp exhale over the radio. To what? I don't know yet. Give me 30 seconds. She swept the scope across the terrain north of the third position's last known location. The ridgeline above. The approach angles toward the assault element's current hold position. The terrain features that offered concealment for a small element moving quickly under low light. 20 seconds. Nothing on the ridgeline. Nothing on the northern approach. She dropped her scan lower, toward the ground level, toward the low terrain that ran between the hold position and the secondary structure, the route Walker had just redirected his team toward. And there they were, 4 of them. Moving fast through the low ground, using the noise cover of the remaining fire from the second position before she had taken it down. They had used the ambush initiation not to destroy the assault element, but to push them to create enough pressure and confusion that the ground team would move and to anticipate where they would move. Toward the secondary structure. The secondary structure that the command element was now positioning between the assault element and the hostage. Actual. Stop. Don't move toward the northeast. They're running a blocking element into the approach. 4 personnel low ground moving north. They anticipated the redirect. The silence on the radio lasted exactly 1 second. Then Walker said very quietly, "They knew about the hostage location." Yes. They knew we'd figure it out. They planned for it. This entire setup the facility as a false target, the prepared ambush on the facility approach, the sniper position to test our overwatch capability. It was designed to push us, not to stop us, to push us to a specific location at a specific time. Walker said the quiet, sharp word again. Then, they have someone. Inside the intelligence chain. That's my assessment. Another beat. Senior Chief Reed's voice low and hard. Commander, if they're running a blocking element to the northeast, they're not trying to destroy us. They're trying to put us in a crossfire between the facility ambush and the blocking position. We're being herded. I know, Walker said. And for the first time since the operation had begun, his voice carried something that Ava recognized not as weakness, but as the specific quality of a very experienced man who has encountered the limits of his experience and is deciding what to do about it. He said, Overwatch, options. Not as a formality, not as a courtesy, as a genuine request from someone who had finally, under the worst possible conditions, understood what he had dismissed in a briefing room 7 hours ago. Ava was already working it. She gave him 3 options. The first was full extraction pull. Every element back to the original insertion point, abort the mission, return to base with the intelligence they had gathered, and rebuild the operation from a clean foundation. This option preserved all personnel with the lowest risk profile. It also abandoned the hostage and gave the enemy confirmation that their intelligence had successfully compromised the operation, which meant they would move the hostage immediately and the intelligence chain leak would go undetected while they had time to cover it. Walker said next. The second was a diversionary assault on the facility. Send a small element, 2 operators toward the facility, in a manner designed to appear like a primary assault, which would pull the command element and the blocking position back toward the facility to respond, while the primary element moved to the secondary structure under that cover. This option had a reasonable probability of success, but required 2 operators to deliberately draw fire, which meant it required 2 operators to accept a significantly elevated risk profile in order to create space for the rest. Walker said, Who takes the facility diversion? That's your call. And the third option? The third option was the one she had been working since she identified the blocking element's movement pattern. It was also the one she hadn't fully committed to describing yet, because it required something from Walker that she wasn't sure he was ready to give. It required him to trust her completely. Not partially, not conditionally, completely. The third option, she said, requires your full element to move to the secondary structure immediately on a route I designate moving on my mark. I clear the blocking element before you reach their position. Your team moves through the gap while they're still processing the contact. You reach the secondary structure with speed and surprise intact. The entire sequence from my mark to your breach needs to happen in under 4 minutes. A pause. You'd need to clear a 4-man element fast enough that they can't report back. Yes. In low light. At what distance? The near positions are inside 300 meters from my current location. The far positions are closer to 450. 4 targets at 2 different distances in under 4 minutes. 3.5. I need 30 seconds of margin for your element's approach timing. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She could hear it on the team channel, the operators holding their positions in the cold listening processing. These were experienced men. They understood what she was proposing. They understood what it required of her and what it required of them. Senior Chief Reed spoke first. Commander. His voice had changed. Something in it had shifted from the careful neutrality he had maintained toward Ava since she walked through the briefing room door. I've been running operations for 12 years. What she's describing, the analysis, the track identification, the sniper shot, the blocking element. Call. I don't know. 3 people alive who could have put all of that together in the time she's had. 3.5 minutes at those distances it's at the edge of what I'd call possible. But, Walker said, but she's been right about everything else tonight. The radio was quiet. Then Walker said, Overwatch. You understand what happens if you miss one of those 4? Yes. My team is inside the blocking element's range. Yes. If you miss one, I won't miss. She said it without arrogance. She said it the same way she would have said any other piece of operational information as a fact, accessible against the evidence offered without decoration. She had run the calculation. She knew the distances. She knew the wind. She knew her equipment, and she knew her capability, and she knew the gap between them. She would not miss. Walker heard the difference between arrogance and certainty. After 15 years of combat operations, he knew what certainty sounded like. Elements, he said. Prepare to move on Overwatch's mark. 4-minute window. We move fast, we move clean. We do not stop until we're at the breach point. Questions. Kowalski's voice. Rules of engagement at the structure. Protect the hostage. Everything else is secondary. Copy. Overwatch. Walker's voice directed at her now, with a quality it had never carried in the briefing room. Direct. Present. No distance in it. Your call when you're ready. Ava looked through her scope. The blocking element was still moving. They had slowed slightly. She thought they had heard something, perhaps the absence of fire from the ambush positions she had taken down. A silence that read wrong to trained operators, but they hadn't stopped. They were committed to their route, committed to their position. They didn't know she had found them. That was the last advantage she had, and she had approximately 90 seconds before the distance closed enough that Walker's element would need to start moving. She identified the 4 positions, mapped them in sequence, near to far left to right, because the near left position had the clearest sightline to the assault element's approach route and needed to go first, and because moving left to right in sequence minimized the transition time between shots. She set her breathing. She found the near left. She fired. 1. Transition. 280 meters. Wind adjustment minimal at this distance. The second figure had frozen, heard the shot processing, which gave her a stationary target for exactly the time she needed. She fired. 2. Transition. 430 meters now. Wind compensation increased. The third figure was reacting, starting to drop, which meant she needed to lead slightly, not the target's current position, but the position the body was moving toward in the act of taking cover. She fired. 3. The fourth position was the problem. The fourth figure had not frozen and had not dropped in the predictable way that training sometimes produced under sudden contact. The fourth figure had broken right fast, moving toward a rock formation that would put him behind cover in approximately 2 seconds. She tracked. She had to be ahead of him. Not where he was going to be when the bullet arrived. She calculated. She fired. 4. The radio silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then Walker's voice. Overwatch. Status. Blocking element is down. All 4. Move now. And the assault element moved. She tracked them through her scope as they covered the ground to the secondary structure. Fat. Disciplined. Moving with the economy of men who had done this so many times that the mechanics of it were below conscious thought, leaving their minds free for the variables. They were good. She had known they were good before she walked into the briefing room. The file she had read on Walker's team told her they were among the most capable assault elements in the Naval Special Warfare inventory. The problem had never been their capability. The problem had been the information they were working from and the assumptions that had shaped how they processed that information. 60 seconds. They were halfway to the structure. She kept her scope moving across the terrain, searching for any element she had missed, any position that had stayed dark during the ambush initiation and might now be activating in response to the assault element's movement. Nothing on the northern ridge, nothing on the eastern approach. She dropped her scan back toward the facility, the false target, the anchor of the operation that had almost gotten 11 men killed, and registered a detail that stopped her cold. Movement, not from outside the facility, from inside it. A single figure moving through the facility from the northeast corner toward the western edge. Moving fast. Moving with the purposeful urgency of someone who had heard the contact outside and was responding to it. Moving toward a vehicle she had categorized earlier as a support vehicle, but was now with the figure running toward it, reclassifying as something else entirely. A relay. If that figure reached the vehicle and transmitted whoever was running this operation from whatever command position existed outside the immediate engagement area, would know that the assault element had not taken the facility route. Would know that the blocking element had been eliminated. Would know that the secondary structure was being approached. And would have time, possibly enough time, to do what enemy forces always did when a hostage extraction operation was compromised. Actual. Her voice was still steady, still controlled. But she was already calculating the distance to the facility, already accounting for the new wind reading, already adjusting for the position change since her last shot at that orientation. I have a figure inside the facility moving toward a vehicle. I assess relay function. If he transmits, they'll know you're at the secondary structure. Walker's voice breathless now with movement, fast-moving fast. Distance, 1,800 meters from my current position. A beat. Overwatch. I know what it is. Can you give me a yes or no on authorization? I don't have time for the discussion. Another beat. 1 second, the longest single second of the operation. Authorized. 1,800 meters, in mountain terrain. With a crosswind that had shifted twice in the last 6 minutes and would shift again before the bullet arrived. She had made longer shots in training. She had made one longer shot in an operational context 18 months ago in conditions. She had never written in her official record because the shot itself was at the boundary of what most people believed was possible. And she had learned early that the things that were hardest to believe were the things you never led with. She ran the full calculation: distance, wind vector, elevation differential, temperature effect on air density, the Coriolis effect, which at this distance was not negligible, the specific ballistic coefficient of the round she was firing, and the velocity decay over that distance, and the drop compensation required at the point of impact. She built the firing solution. She settled the reticle. She controlled her breathing. She waited for the figure to reach the position she had calculated for impact. She fired. The figure at the facility reached the vehicle, stopped, dropped. The vehicle door never opened. Relay is down. Her voice was completely level. He didn't transmit. The silence on the radio was different from every previous silence in the operation. It was not the silence of deliberation, or assessment, or calculation. It was the silence of men who had just heard something that sat at the outer edge of what they were prepared to accept as real. Kowalski's voice barely above a whisper. Did she just keep moving? Walker said. His voice was stripped of everything except the mission. But underneath the function, underneath the command precision, something had shifted. She could hear it even at 2 miles. 30 seconds to breach. She tracked them to the structure, watched the breach. Fast, clean, coordinated Walker's team moved through the entry in a sequence that told her everything she needed to know about why they were considered among the best. Even operating in a degraded information environment, even having spent the last 40 minutes in a hold position, being reassessed and redirected, and asked to trust someone. They had dismissed 8 hours ago. They performed with a crispness that was the product of thousands of repetitions, and the kind of mutual trust between operators that could not be manufactured and could not be faked. 15 seconds inside. She waited. The radio was silent during the breach. Standard protocol. You didn't break concentration with radio traffic during a structure clearance unless something went catastrophically wrong, because the 1 second of distraction a transmission created could be the 1 second that cost everything. 25 seconds. 30. Then Walker's voice. Overwatch. We have him. Hostage is secure. He's alive. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them. Because the terrain was still active. Because there were positions she hadn't fully cleared. Because the intelligence leak that had compromised this operation was still out there, and the person responsible for it was still out there. And until Walker's element was back at extraction, with the hostage secured, her job was not finished. Copy that. I'm covering your exfil. Move when ready. And then, Senior Chief Reed said something over the radio that she had not expected to hear from the man who had stood by his coffee mug in the briefing room and offered Walker nothing. Overwatch. Reed's voice. Deliberate, direct, stripped of qualification. That last shot. 1,800 meters. I've been doing this for 12 years. I've never seen anything like that. She didn't respond immediately. She was watching the terrain. Then she said, Move your people, Senior Chief. We can debrief when everyone's home. Reed said, Copy, and the element began moving toward extraction. But Walker's voice came back one more time. Just to her, not on the team channel. Lieutenant Bennett. Sir. Back in that briefing room. A pause. Not hesitation, reflection. The kind of pause a man makes when he is being precise about something. I said I asked for a sniper, and not someone who still needed to prove she belonged here. She waited. I was wrong about both things, he said. You didn't need to prove anything. And you are absolutely the sniper I asked for. She watched the assault element moving through the terrain below her, the hostage moving with them, the mission that had almost been a catastrophe, instead becoming the thing it was supposed to be. Get your people home, Commander, she said. That's all I need. She pressed her eye back to the scope, and kept watching, because that was the job. And the job wasn't finished until everyone was safe. But somewhere in the cold and the dark of the mountain, with 11 operators and 1 rescued hostage moving toward extraction. Below her, she allowed herself to understand that something had changed on this mountain tonight. Not just the mission, not just Walker's assessment of her. Something structural, something that had been built over years of dismissal and assumption and laughter in briefing rooms. A weight that she had been carrying without ever naming it as weight had shifted. Not because she had needed it to shift. Because the work had shifted it. The way it always did eventually. The way her father had told her it always would. And Ava Bennett, who had learned that lesson in 100 different ways, in 100 different places, kept watching. 1 sweep. 2. And on the 3rd sweep across the northern approach, the ridgeline she had cleared twice already, the terrain she had catalogued and assessed and considered closed, she saw something that made her hands go completely, perfectly still. A flash. Small. Brief. The kind of light that a lens makes when it catches an angle of illumination for a fraction of a second. The kind of light that meant one thing and one thing only. Someone was watching back, and they were watching Walker's extraction route. She was already moving before the thought was fully formed. Because the mission wasn't over. It had just changed shape again. The flash lasted less than a second. Most people would have blinked and told themselves it was nothing. A reflection off a wet rock surface. A trick of the pre-dawn light playing across the terrain. The kind of thing exhausted eyes manufactured after hours of sustained focus in difficult conditions. Ava Bennett was not most people. She had spent years learning the difference between what eyes invented and what they actually recorded, and what she had recorded in that fraction of a second was not an accident of light on rock. The angle was wrong for reflection. The duration was wrong for atmospheric scatter. The position 11 degrees left of the ridgeline she had already cleared at a depression. She had assessed as empty. 40 minutes ago was exactly the kind of position a trained operator would choose if they had watched her clear it and waited for her to move her attention elsewhere. Someone had been watching her clear the ridgeline. Someone had been patient enough to stay completely still while she swept that position twice. Someone was on this mountain who was not part of Walker's team, not part of the blocking element she had already eliminated, and not part of the facility ambush she had dismantled. Someone who had been here before any of them arrived. She keyed the radio with the particular controlled urgency that communicated maximum information in minimum words. Actual, I have a possible hostile observer on the northern ridge. Bearing 347 from my position. Do not alter your extraction route yet. Maintain current pace and heading. Walker's voice came back immediately. Define possible. Lens flash, 1/4 second. Position I previously assessed as clear. A beat. She could hear the sound of movement through his transmitter. The team still walking, still covering ground toward extraction, the hostage moving with them. Could be equipment. It could be, it isn't. Another beat. How do you know? Because equipment doesn't choose a position based on my previous observation pattern. Whatever is on that ridge selected a depression I had already cleared. That's not accident. That's someone who watched me work. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long, which was a very long silence for a man moving toward an extraction point with a rescued hostage. Then Walker said, "What do you need? Keep moving, exactly as you're moving. Don't give them a behavioral change that tells them you know they're there. I'm going to reposition and work the problem." Timeline. 8 minutes, maybe less. We reach extraction in 12. Then we have margin. Keep moving, Commander. She was already repositioning. Moving toward a threat, while maintaining concealment from that threat, required a specific kind of discipline that was different from every other form of movement she performed operationally. When you were moving away from a threat, speed was your primary asset. When you were moving parallel to a threat, concealment was your primary asset. When you were moving toward a threat, toward someone who was themselves a trained operator, who understood the terrain, who had already demonstrated the patience to hold a prepared position through an extended engagement, the primary asset was something harder to name. Her father had called it composure, not the composure of stillness. The composure of a mind that refused to accelerate beyond its own optimal processing speed, regardless of what the situation was demanding. Most people under genuine threat experienced a mental acceleration that felt like clarity, but was actually the opposite. A narrowing of attention so severe that critical information fell outside the field of focus and was lost. The operators who performed best in these most difficult conditions were the ones who had learned to identify that acceleration in themselves and slow it back down deliberately, the way you brought a vehicle back from overspeed, not by slamming the brake, but by gradual controlled deceleration that kept the wheels on the road. She moved across the terrain in a wide arc that kept her below the ridgeline, using the reverse slope as concealment, covering ground with the slow, deliberate foot placement that left no sound signature. The cold had her now. The cold that the adrenaline of the last 2 hours had been holding at a distance had found its way back in, and her hands were working at the edge of their dexterity range, which meant she needed to account for a slight increase in trigger response time. She cataloged it, set it aside, continued. 90 seconds of movement brought her to a position 40 meters below and 60 meters east of the depression where she had seen the flash. From here, she had an angle on the depression that her previous position had not provided. She settled behind the terrain feature that gave her concealment, raised her scope, and looked. He was there. And he was extraordinary. She had been operating at a high professional level for long enough to recognize immediately and without resentment when she was looking at someone who was operating at the same level or above it. The figure in the depression was not just using good concealment. He was using the terrain the way she used it, not as a hiding place, but as an extension of his own tactical geometry. His position gave him 3 separate egress routes. His profile was broken against the rock in a way that eliminated his human silhouette completely at any angle, except the one she currently occupied, which he had clearly assessed as a dead angle from her previous position. He had a long rifle. He was looking through a scope. He was looking at Walker's extraction route. And in the time she had spent repositioning the extraction element had moved close enough to his position that if he fired now, he would have a shot. She had no time left for extended calculation. She identified the target, ran the compressed version of the firing solution distance, approximately 60 meters, which was close enough that wind and elevation were negligible factors, which reduced the calculation to pure geometry and execution. She had the angle, she had the line, she had the shot. But she didn't take it, because in the last 2 seconds of her observation, something had changed. The figure in the depression had not fired, had not adjusted his scope toward the extraction element even as they moved into his range. He was holding. Not in the patient predatory way of a sniper, waiting for the perfect moment. In a different way. A way she had seen before in training exercises when an opposing force element was waiting for a coordination signal before engaging. He wasn't alone. She pulled back from the immediate geometry and forced her mind to expand. She had been thinking about this figure as a single threat, a hostile sniper who had survived the engagement and repositioned for a final shot at the extraction. But a single hostile sniper who had survived through extraordinary patience and concealment, positioned on the extraction route with a clear shot available and not taking it, waiting for something. Waiting for something. She scanned fast. Wider. The terrain around the extraction route that Walker's element was currently moving through. The ground-level positions that a coordinating element would use if they were running a 2-part ambush, one shooter triggering the contact from the ridge while a ground element moved in from below. She found them in 11 seconds. 3 figures. Ground level. moving along the low ground parallel to the extraction route, staying just below Walker's sight line, closing the distance at a pace that would put them inside 50 meters of the element in approximately 90 seconds. The ground element was the primary threat. The sniper on the ridge was the containment positioned to prevent the extraction element from reversing course when the ground contact initiated. It was a simple, effective trap, and it would have worked completely against anyone who hadn't known to look for it. Actual. Her voice was compressed and fast. Stop moving, right now. Ground element below your left flank. 3 personnel, 90 seconds from your position. Hostile sniper on the ridge has you ranged from above. You are in a 2-layer ambush. Stop and go to ground. She heard Walker's command bark across the team channel instantly. Down. All elements down. The team dropped. The ground element, which had been timing their approach to Walker's movement pace, suddenly lost the behavioral reference they were tracking. She heard the change not through the radio, but in the way the mountain sounded when human movement that had been consistent suddenly became unpredictable. It wasn't a sound she could have described to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read the acoustic signature of terrain. It was a quality. A different kind of silence. They had stopped too. Everyone was still now. Waiting. The ground element waiting for Walker's team to resume movement. Walker's team waiting for Ava's direction. The ridge sniper waiting for the ground element's initiation signal. And Ava working the geometry. She had 2 problems and 1 rifle, and a sequence that required her to solve both problems in an order that didn't give either threat time to respond between shots. The ridge sniper was closer, but the ground element was the primary threat, because the ground element was armed for close quarters contact, and 3 personnel at 50 meters against a 9-man element with a hostage was a catastrophic problem even for operators of Walker's caliber. She needed to clear the ground element first, but the ground element was below the ridge line, and the ridge sniper had a sight line to her current position that he hadn't used yet, which meant he either hadn't found her or hadn't been authorized to engage her yet, and the moment she fired on the ground element, the moment she fired, the ridge sniper would know exactly where she was. And at 60 meters, even with the terrain feature giving her partial cover, he would have a workable shot. She needed to solve them simultaneously, which was not possible with 1 rifle and 1 shooter. She pressed transmit. Actual. I need a secondary engagement from your position. The ridge sniper is at bearing 347 60 meters from my position. I cannot clear the ground element without exposing myself to his return fire. Can anyone in your element range that position? Walker's voice immediately. Kowalski, you have the ridge bearing. Kowalski, I have it. I can't see the target, Commander. The depression is below my sight line from here. Can you suppress without a target? A beat. I can put fire on the position. Won't be a clean kill. Overwatch. Walker to her now. Suppression on the ridge buys you the window. She thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Suppression on the ridge sniper's position, not a kill shot, not a clean engagement, but enough incoming fire that the sniper had to take cover and could not maintain a stable firing platform for 3 to 4 seconds was enough. 3 to 4 seconds was longer than she needed for the ground element if she was already on the first target when the suppression began. It buys me the window, she said. Kowalski puts fire on that depression the moment I engage the first ground target. I clear all 3 before the ridge sniper can reposition and acquire me. That's a 3-shot sequence in under 4 seconds. Yes. Overwatch. Commander. Her voice was flat and certain. You asked me what I needed. That's what I need. Kowalski on the ridge on my first shot. Can he do it? Kowalski's voice. I can do it. Do it. Walker, do it. Overwatch, call your shot. She found the first ground target in her reticle. The nearest figure moving slowly now that Walker's team had stopped trying to read the behavioral change. The figure was partially exposed above the low ground as they crept forward, trying to see why the element had gone static. She controlled her breathing. She found the window between heartbeats. Shot out. She fired. The first figure dropped. Kowalski opened fire on the ridge. Depression, simultaneously, she heard it across the mountain. a controlled burst that hit the rock face above the depression and filled the sniper's immediate environment with fragmented material and the kind of disorienting sound pressure that made maintaining a stable scope picture essentially impossible for several seconds. She was already on the second ground target. The second figure had reacted, was moving laterally, trying to get back below the low ground line, and she led the movement calculated, the intercept fired. 2. The third figure broke, running, not toward Walker's element and not toward the ridge, but laterally parallel to the extraction route, moving fast with the specific urgent energy of someone who has just watched two people drop in rapid succession and has decided that the mission parameters no longer outweigh the survival imperative. Running targets at variable distance in mountain terrain were the hardest version of the problem. She tracked, calculated the pace, the stride length, the likely next change in direction based on the terrain features ahead of the running figure. She needed to be where the figure was going to be, not where they were. She fired. 3. Ground element is clear, she said. Kowalski, cease fire on the ridge. Kowalski's fire stopped. The mountain went quiet. She swung back to the ridge depression immediately. The sniper was gone. Not down. Gone. He had used Kowalski's suppression as cover for movement rolled out of the depression during the incoming fire and relocated while she was working the ground element. She swept the ridgeline fast, looking for movement for a profile break for the lens flash that had given him away the first time. Nothing. Actual. Ridge sniper has relocated. I've lost him. Do not resume movement until I reacquire. Walker's voice was tight. Copy. Elements hold. She swept the ridgeline again. Slower this time, forcing herself out of the accelerated pace that the last 60 seconds had pushed her toward. This was the moment that got people killed, the transition from high-tempo engagement back to the patient, methodical observation that threat detection required. The body wanted to keep moving at the tempo of the engagement. The mind had to override it and slow back down. She swept slowly, left to right. The ridgeline above the depression. The terrain to the east of the depression. The ground below the ridgeline on the western side, where a relocating sniper with good training might drop to use the reverse slope the same way she had used it on her approach. There. Not on the ridgeline. Below it. 40 meters below the depression on the western reverse slope, exactly where she would have gone. He had moved toward her. That was not what she had anticipated, and the fact that it wasn't anticipated told her something critical about who she was dealing with. A sniper who relocated during suppression and moved toward the threat rather than away from it was not making a defensive decision. He was making an offensive one. He had assessed his position as compromised and decided that the response to a compromised position was not to find a new hide, but to eliminate the threat that had compromised it. He was hunting her, and he had moved to a position that gave him a better angle on her current location. She had approximately 30 seconds before he would be settled enough to range her effectively. She did not have time to relocate. She had to work the problem from where she was. The terrain feature giving her cover was solid on three sides. The side facing the ridge sniper's new position was partially exposed. She had about 40% of her body profile visible to anyone at his current location and angle. Not ideal, not impossible. She found his position in her scope. He was settling in, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who was very, very good at this. She watched his hands, the way he positioned the rifle, the way his body found the ground, the way his head dropped toward the scope, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. He was good. He was possibly as good as she was. The difference was that she had found him first. She lined the shot, compressed the firing solution, controlled her breathing, found the stillness between heartbeats that her father had spent 3 years teaching her to locate on demand. She fired. The ridge sniper's rifle moved. Not the deliberate movement of a man repositioning his shot. The involuntary final movement of a man whose firing solution would never be completed. Silence. Absolute silence on the mountain. Then Walker's voice very quietly. Overwatch. Status. Ridge sniper is down. She took a single controlled breath. Extraction route is clear. You can move. A long pause. You're certain. She swept the terrain one more time. Full scan. Left to right, far to near ridgeline to ground level, to the low terrain of the extraction route itself. Move your people, Commander. The team began moving. She tracked them through the scope, as they covered the remaining ground to the extraction point, Walker at the rear, watching their back trail with the specific alertness of a man who has spent the last hour learning what the terrain was capable of hiding. Kowalski on point. Reed running security on the left flank. The hostage, she could see him now in her scope, moving under his own power, which told her he was in better condition than a week of captivity might have left him positioned in the center of the formation, protected on all sides. They were going to make it. The thought arrived quietly, without celebration, the way certainty arrived for her, not as a feeling, but as a calculated assessment. They had the route, they had the pace, they had the timing, and the mountain was clean. She had cleared it. Every threat she had identified, every position that had been prepared to kill these men was gone. They were going to make it. And then, Walker's voice came over the radio, and the quality of it was different from anything she had heard from him in the last 8 hours. Overwatch. A pause. I owe you something I should have said before we left the wire. She kept her eye on the scope, kept tracking the team. Move your people, Commander. I will. But I need to say this while I still understand clearly why it matters. Another pause. She could hear his footsteps, the steady crunch of his movement, the rhythm of a man talking and moving at the same time. I walked into that briefing room this morning with 12 years of operational experience and the complete certainty that I knew exactly what a qualified operator looked like. And I was wrong. Not about the mission, not about the threat assessment. I was wrong about you specifically, and that specific wrongness almost got my entire team killed. She said nothing. I'm not saying this because the mission worked out. I'm saying it because it almost didn't, and the reason it almost didn't was a decision I made before I had a single piece of evidence. You gave me evidence. You gave me multiple pieces of evidence. And I ignored every one of them because I had already decided what the evidence was worth based on who was presenting it. Kowalski's voice on the team channel low, and with a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Commander, same goes from me. Then Reed, and me. The mountain was quiet. Walker's team was 70 meters from the extraction point. Ava watched them through her scope and said nothing for a moment. Not because she didn't have anything to say, because what she had to say required a precision she wanted to get right. Commander, she said finally. In the briefing room when you laughed, I want you to understand something. I wasn't angry. I've heard that laugh in enough rooms that it stopped having the power to make me angry a long time ago. What I was determined, because I knew that the only way the laugh ever stopped mattering was if the work made it irrelevant. And the work makes it irrelevant every time if you let it. A silence. That's more than I deserved, Walker said. It's not about what you deserved. It's about what actually happened and what we do with it. 50 meters to extraction. She kept watching. They reached the extraction point at 0634. The helicopter came in from the east, running low and fast, and the sound of its rotors was the best sound Ava had heard since the mission began. She watched the team board through her scope. Walker last, as a good commander, always was conducting one final visual scan of the approach before pulling himself through the door, and she stayed on the ridgeline until the helicopter had cleared the mountain and was beyond the range of any threat she had catalogued. Then she began her own movement to extraction, alone, as she had arrived. Moving through the mountain terrain with the same deliberate, patient economy that had carried her through the night. The cold was fully on her now. The adrenaline had been burning for hours and was finally drawing down, and what it left behind was the physical reality of a night spent at altitude, in freezing temperatures, with a sustained attention demand that most people couldn't have maintained for a quarter of the duration. She felt it. She filed it away. She kept moving. Her mind in the spaces between the demands of navigation was working something that it had been setting aside all night in favor of the operational requirements. The thing that Walker had said quietly and almost incidentally in the middle of his transmission about the sniper's relay position. They have someone. Inside the intelligence chain, she had agreed with that assessment in the moment because the operational evidence supported it. Post-imagery vehicle tracks. A kill zone built around a known approach route. An ambush that had anticipated not just the primary assault, but the secondary. Redirect the adjustment to the northeast structure that should have been an improvised response to intelligence gathered on the ground, not a possibility the enemy had already planned for. Someone had told them, not just the approach route, not just the timeline, the contingency, the specific operational behavior pattern of this team in this type of mission, including the likelihood that an experienced Overwatch element would identify the facility as a false target and redirect to a secondary structure. Someone had told them enough about how this team operated that the ambush could account for their adaptive behavior. That level of intelligence penetration didn't come from signals collection or pattern observation. It came from access. From someone who had sat in the same rooms where mission parameters were developed and had taken what they learned and passed it to people who used it to build a mountain full of prepared positions and false targets and coordinated ambush layers. And that person was not on the mountain. That person was in a building somewhere. A base. A headquarters. Sitting behind a desk or in a briefing room or eating breakfast in a cafeteria. And they had no idea that the operation they had compromised had succeeded anyway, because the one element they hadn't accounted for was a 25-year-old female Navy SEAL sniper who a commander had laughed at in a briefing room and who had spent the entire night being exactly right about everything. The leak was still active. The mission was over. But the larger problem was not. She reached her extraction point at 0651. A different vehicle than the helicopter, a ground extraction standard protocol for an Overwatch element operating separately from the primary assault. The driver was a young petty officer who had clearly been briefed on nothing about the night's events, who looked at her when she climbed in and said, "Rough one, ma'am," with the cheerful, unknowing energy of someone who had spent the night at base. She looked at him. "Drive," she said. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat and let the warmth of the vehicle's interior begin to address the cold that had settled into her, and she stared through the windshield at the road ahead, and her mind stayed on the thing that hadn't been solved. The leak. By the time the vehicle reached Iron Valley Base, she had the beginning of a framework. Not a conclusion, not yet, but the architecture of an analysis. The type of intelligence that had been passed. The operational detail level required to build what the enemy had built on that mountain. The access profile that would be necessary to gather that specific combination of information. Approach routes. Timeline team, behavioral patterns. Contingency response modeling. The number of people who held that access profile. It was not a long list. She was going to need to see the personnel files, and she was going to need Walker to give her access to them, which meant she was going to need to tell him what she believed before she could prove it, which meant she was going to need him to trust her assessment without evidence one more time. She thought about that. She thought about the voice on the radio when he said, "I was wrong about you specifically." She thought it might be enough. The vehicle pulled through the gate at Iron Valley Base at 0719. Walker was standing outside the operations building. He was waiting for her. She climbed out of the vehicle, and he looked at her across the distance between them. This commander who had laughed at her 15 hours ago, who had ignored every piece of intelligence she had presented until the mountain had forced his hand, who had spent the last hour of a helicopter flight back to base, presumably sitting with everything the night had cost him and taught him, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't the particular expression of a man performing an apology for an audience. It was attention. Real, unfiltered structural attention. The look of a man who has reclassified something and is looking at it clearly for the first time. She crossed the distance between them. He said, "I need to debrief you." "You need to listen to me first," she said. "Because we have a problem that didn't end when the helicopter left the mountain." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. The kind of alertness that comes when someone confirms a suspicion you were already carrying. "The leak," he said. "Yes. I've been thinking about it since the extraction." "So have I." She met his eyes. "I need personnel file access. The access profile for whoever did this is specific enough that I can narrow the field significantly, but I need the files." Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside." And he held the door open. It was a small gesture. The kind of thing that would have meant nothing in a different context, and meant everything in this one. Not because it was chivalrous, she didn't need a door held open, and he wasn't doing it for that reason. He was doing it because every instinct he had built over 15 years of commanding operators was now pointing him in one direction, and that direction was toward the woman standing in front of him. And the gesture was the physical expression of that recalibration. She walked through the door. The work was not finished, it had simply moved inside. And Ava Bennett, who had spent a night on a mountain clearing threats that should have been cataloged before the first operator stepped off the wire, who had made shots that the mission assessment would have categorized as outside operational parameters, who had done all of it while being the person nobody in that briefing room had wanted to be there, walked into the operations building and began working the next problem. Because that was what she did. Not because she needed to prove something. Because there was work to be done, and she was the one who could do it. The operations building at Iron Valley Base had a particular quality in the hours after a mission, a specific atmospheric pressure that every operator who had ever worked there recognized and nobody ever talked about. It was the pressure of people who had been running on adrenaline and cold air, and the particular clarity that danger produced suddenly inside four walls under fluorescent lighting. The mountain behind them and the paperwork ahead of them. Their bodies still calibrated for threat, and their minds beginning the slow, uncomfortable process of returning to something that resembled normal. Nobody in the building that morning looked normal. Walker's team had come off the helicopter with the hostage, a government contractor named David Rice, 43 years old. 8 days in captivity, physically intact, but carrying the specific hollowness in his eyes that people carried after they had spent time believing they were going to die, and then discovered they weren't. Rice had been taken to the medical facility immediately. He hadn't said much during the extraction or the flight back. He had looked at Walker once on the helicopter and said, "I didn't think anyone was coming." And Walker had said, "We were always coming." And Rice had looked out the window for the rest of the flight and said nothing else. The team had gone through initial debrief processing the standard sequence of documentation and medical checks, and the particular administrative machinery that existed to convert a completed mission into a file that could be archived. Kowalski had a graze on his left forearm from the ambush initiation that the medic cleaned and dressed without drama. Reed had twisted his right knee on the approach to the secondary structure and was walking with a slight hitch he was refusing to acknowledge. Everyone else was physically intact. Ava had bypassed the standard processing sequence, not because she was avoiding it. She would complete it because the paperwork was the paperwork, and ignoring it created problems she didn't need. But Walker had agreed she needed personnel file access before anything else, and personnel file access required Walker's authorization codes, and Walker's authorization codes required Walker to be present and functional, rather than standing in a processing line, so they had gone directly to the operations center, and Walker had pulled the files while Ava stood behind him, and the rest of the team filtered in gradually one by one, because they had all heard enough of what she had said outside to understand that the debrief they were about to have was not the standard kind. The files appeared on the screen. Ava looked at them. "I need mission planning access records for the last 30 days, she said. "Everyone who accessed the operational parameters for this mission. Not just the file, the access logs. Every timestamp, every terminal ID, every duration." Walker typed the request. The system processed it. The list that came back was longer than she had hoped, and shorter than she had feared. 17 names. The 17 personnel who had accessed the full operational parameters for the Iron Valley extraction mission between the initial planning phase and mission execution. She read through it. She read it again. She was looking for a specific pattern, not just access, but access timing. The intelligence that had been used to build the mountain ambush required lead time. The vehicle tracks she had identified as post-imagery had been placed within a specific window, which meant the information that allowed the enemy to prepare those positions had been transmitted before that window, which meant the access that mattered wasn't someone who had looked at the file the night before the mission. It was someone who had looked at it early, during planning, when the approach routes were still being developed and the timeline was still being established. She cross-referenced the access timestamps against the mission planning timeline. 14 of the 17 accesses happened in the final 48 hours before mission execution. Standard behavior mission personnel reviewing parameters immediately prior to execution. 3 accesses happened during the planning phase. The first was Walker himself, which was expected and irrelevant. The second was the mission planning officer, a lieutenant commander named Hargrove, which was equally expected. The third was a name she didn't recognize immediately. Master Chief Petty Officer Raymond Doss. She looked at the name for the moment. Then she said, "Who is Raymond Doss?" Walker turned from the screen and looked at the name. His expression did something complicated. "Master Chief Doss is the Senior Enlisted Advisor for Special Operations Group 7, he said. He's been with the command for 6 years, decorated. 2 combat deployments before he moved into the advisory role. He's—" Walker stopped. "He's what?" "He's someone I would have put on the list of the last 10 people in this command I would suspect of anything." She had expected that. The person doing this was not going to be someone who had given anyone reason for suspicion. The entire operational sophistication of what had been built on that mountain required someone who had been trusted completely for long enough to accumulate the access and the knowledge and the relationships necessary to pass useful intelligence. That kind of trust took years to build. It also took years of deliberate, careful performance to maintain while using that trust as cover. "What's his access justification for the planning phase?" she asked. Walker pulled the secondary record. The justification field read, "Senior Enlisted Advisory Review, Operational Risk Assessment." "Is that standard?" she asked. Walker was quiet for a moment. "For Group 7 missions, yes. The Senior Enlisted Advisor has a standing authorization to conduct risk assessment review during planning phases. It's part of the advisory function." "Is it documented?" "The review itself, not just the access." "Is there a risk assessment output that corresponds to this access?" Walker navigated to the planning file. He searched for a risk assessment document filed by Doss during the planning phase. Nothing. He searched again with different parameters. Still nothing. "There's no output," Walker said. He accessed the full operational parameters during planning and produced no documented risk assessment. That could mean the assessment was informal, verbal. Some senior advisors work that way. "Could," she said. "But it means there's no record of what he did with the information he accessed." Walker's jaw tightened slightly. She could see it from where she was standing, the specific tension of a man who is beginning to build a case against someone he respected, running each piece of evidence against the resistance that familiarity created. "Raymond Doss has been with this command for 6 years, he said again. Not as an argument, more as something he needed to say out loud while he adjusted to the weight of what he was considering. "I know," she said. "That's what makes him useful to whoever is running him." Walker turned in his chair and looked at her directly. "You're certain?" "I'm not certain of anything except the evidence. The evidence is thin right now. It's enough to look harder. It's not enough to act. But your gut." She considered that. Her father had believed in operational intuition, had told her it was the accumulated product of pattern recognition, running faster than conscious analysis. Not mysticism, not feeling, but compressed data processing. He had also told her that operational intuition was only as reliable as the quality of the data that fed it, and that the most dangerous version of intuition was the kind that confirmed what you already wanted to believe. She had no reason to want to believe Raymond Doss was the leak. She had never met him, had no personal stake in the outcome. The evidence was pointing at him the way evidence pointed without preference or narrative. "My gut says we look at Doss," she said. "My gut also says we look carefully, and we don't tip him before we have something solid, because if he's running long-term intelligence access, and he knows we're looking, he goes dark, and we lose the thread." Walker nodded. Once, slowly. "What do you need?" Before she could answer, the operations center door opened, and Senior Chief Reed walked in. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and moving with the careful gait of someone managing a knee that hurt more than they were admitting. He looked at the screen, looked at Ava, looked at Walker. "Tell me," he said. Walker told him. Reed set both cups of coffee down on the nearest flat surface and stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Raymond Doss." "You know him?" Ava asked. 6 years, Reed said. "I've known the man for 6 years. He was the senior enlisted advisor when I transferred into this command. He's been at every mission brief, every planning session, every after-action review for Group 7 operations during that entire time." He paused. "He's also the person who recommended the approach route for this mission during the planning phase." The operations center went quiet. Walker turned back to the screen. "Pull the planning meeting records," he said. Walker found the record in 40 seconds. A planning meeting held 8 days ago, the initial mission framework session, where approach routes, timelines, and operational parameters had been established. 11 people in the room. One of them, Raymond Doss, who had said according to the meeting transcript that the northern approach route offered the best balance of concealment and timing margin and should be designated as the primary approach, the approach route that the enemy had prepared a complete kill zone along. Kowalski appeared in the doorway. He had heard enough from the corridor to catch the shape of the conversation, and his face had gone to the careful, controlled blankness that experienced operators wore when they were processing something that hit close to home. "He recommended the route," Kowalski said flatly. "He recommended the route," Reed confirmed. "And the enemy built the ambush on the route he recommended." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Ava said, "There's something else. The secondary structure, the northeast building where the hostage actually was. It wasn't in the mission parameters. We identified it from imagery analysis during the mission itself, which means Doss couldn't have told them about it in advance. But the blocking element that repositioned to cover that structure, they moved there in response to the ambush initiation. They anticipated we'd find the secondary structure and redirect." Walker was following her. "They were briefed on our contingency behavior. Someone told them enough about how this team adapts that they could model the redirect. That's not route intelligence. That's behavioral intelligence. That's someone who has watched this team operate long enough to predict how you'd respond to an ambiguous situation." 6 years, Reed said quietly. 6 years of planning sessions and after-action reviews and mission briefings. 6 years of watching Walker's team develop, adapt, refine their methods. 6 years of the kind of deep institutional knowledge that no signals collection or pattern observation could have produced the intimate granular understanding of how specific operators thought and reacted and made decisions under pressure. Walker stood up. He moved away from the screen and stood with his back to the room for a moment, just standing. Nobody spoke. They understood what he was doing, the same thing Reed had done when he set down the coffee cups. The same thing Kowalski was doing in the doorway. The same thing. All of them were doing in their own way, adjusting to the weight of a betrayal that was personal in the specific sickening way that betrayal by someone trusted always was. Then Walker turned around. "I need to contact the Naval Criminal Investigative Service," he said. "Before we do anything else, before we pull Doss in, before we do additional file access, before we take any step that could alert him. NCIS runs the investigation from this point. We give them everything we have and we stay clean." Ava nodded. It was the right call. It was also, she noted, a different kind of call from the one Walker would have made 15 hours ago. The call of a man who understood now what the cost of bypassing proper assessment looked like and who was not going to make that mistake twice. "While you make that call," she said, "I want to do one more thing." "What?" "Talk to Rice." Walker looked at her. "The hostage," she said. "He was inside that facility network for 8 days. He may have information he doesn't know is information. People who pass intelligence don't always tell their assets everything, but the assets observe things. Reese may have seen something or heard something that fills the evidentiary gap between Doss's access and the operational compromise." Walker considered it for exactly 3 seconds. "Medical cleared him for limited interview an hour ago. I'll take you. You don't need to come." "I know I don't need to." He looked at her steadily. "I want to." David Rice was sitting on the edge of a medical facility cot when they came in holding a cup of water with both hands, the way people held things when they needed to hold something and didn't have a better option. He looked up when the door opened, and his eyes went to Walker first, then to Ava, and his expression shifted slightly when he registered her. Not the dramatic shift of someone confronting a surprise, but the smaller shift of someone recalibrating a detail they hadn't expected. "Who are you?" he asked Ava. "Lieutenant Bennett, I was overwatch for the extraction." Rice looked at her for a moment. "You were on the mountain?" "Yes." "You were the sniper they were using?" "Yes." He absorbed that. Set down the water cup. "Okay," he said, and there was something in the word, not skepticism, not challenge, just the careful provisional acceptance of a man who had been through enough in the last 8 days that he had stopped making assumptions about anything. "What do you need from me?" She sat down across from him. Walker stood near the door. "When you were being held," she said, "did you have any contact with your captors beyond direct guards?" "Some. The first 3 days they kept me isolated. After that—" He stopped, looked at the floor for a moment. "After that they had someone come in, someone who spoke English well, who asked me questions." "What kind of questions?" "Operational questions, about the team that would come for me. Who would lead the mission? What approach routes they typically used. Standard mission planning parameters." He looked up. "I didn't tell them anything useful. I want to be clear about that. I know how these interviews go. I gave them general information that any open-source analysis could have produced." "I understand," Ava said. "I'm not questioning what you told them. I'm interested in what they already seemed to know before they asked." Rice looked at her. The quality of that look changed. She had found the right question, and he could tell she had found the right question, and the shift in his expression was the shift of someone connecting something they had been carrying without context. "The man who questioned me," Rice said slowly. "He already knew the mission timeline. Not approximately, specifically. He knew the 72-hour window. He referenced it directly. He said—" Rice paused, his eyes going to a specific memory. "He said, 'Your team has approximately 60 hours before they move.' That was on the 3rd day of my captivity, which means he knew the timeline before the mission parameters were even fully established." Ava looked at Walker. Walker was very still. "60 hours from the 3rd day of your captivity," she said to Rice. "What date was that?" Rice told her. She did the calculation in her head. The date Rice gave her was 1 day after the initial planning meeting. 1 day after the meeting where Raymond Doss had recommended the northern approach route. 1 day after Doss had accessed the operational parameters for the first time. The timeline closed. "One more question," she said. "The man who questioned you, did he give you any name? Any identifier?" Rice shook his head. "No name. But—" He stopped again, and the pause had the particular quality of someone surfacing a detail they hadn't realized was significant. "He mentioned the command. Specifically. He said, 'Your friends at Iron Valley.' Not the region, not the unit designation, the base name. Iron Valley specifically." Walker made a sound. It was not a word. It was a short, sharp sound. The involuntary auditory expression of something landing hard in the chest of a man who had been building toward a conclusion he hadn't wanted to reach and had just had it confirmed. Iron Valley was not a widely known designation. It was used internally within the command structure among personnel with direct operational affiliation. It was not the kind of name that appeared in signals intelligence or open-source collection. It was the kind of name you knew because someone inside the wire had told you. Ava stood up. "Thank you," she said to Rice. "Rest. The team will complete a full debrief with you when you're ready." Rice looked at her as she stood. "Did you find what you needed?" "Yes," she said. She walked to the door. Walker was already reaching for his radio. NCIS Special Agent Patricia Ewan arrived at Iron Valley Base at 1340. She was a compact, precise woman in her 40s who had the manner of someone who had spent 20 years separating facts from noise and had become very efficient at both parts of the process. She shook hands with Walker, acknowledged Ava, with a look that assessed and categorized in approximately 2 seconds, and sat down with the evidence package they had assembled. She went through it in 45 minutes. Then she looked up. "You built this from mission access logs and a hostage interview," she said to Ava. "Not a question, a confirmation." "And imagery analysis from the operational environment," Ava said. "The timeline correlation between the access log and the information the hostage was given is the key structural piece." Ewan looked at the correlation. "It's circumstantial. It's enough to open a surveillance phase," Walker said. "Which is what we're asking for. Not an arrest, not a confrontation. A clean surveillance operation that either builds the case or eliminates Doss as a suspect without alerting him." Ewan looked at the file again. "Master Chief Raymond Doss," she said. The name had a specific weight in her mouth, the weight of a name attached to a clearance level and a service record that made the case simultaneously more serious and more difficult. 6 years of clean performance. 2 commendations. Senior enlisted advisor. She closed the file. "And you're confident enough in this to put your names on the referral?" Walker said, "Yes." Ewan looked at Ava. "Lieutenant Bennett." "Yes," Ava said. Ewan held her gaze for a moment. The assessment in that look was different from the initial categorization, something more considered, something that was factoring in the full weight of what Ava had produced in the last 12 hours, the evidence she had built, the framework she had constructed. "I've read your service record," Ewan said, and then said nothing else for a moment, which meant the service record had said something significant enough that she had felt the need to mention it. "Then you know I don't make referrals I can't support," Ava said. "I know that," Ewan said. "I also know that the mission report Walker just filed in the last hour describes an Overwatch performance that—" She paused, and for the first time her precision slipped, slightly replaced by something more direct. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've read a lot of mission reports. The report Walker filed for this operation is unlike anything I've seen in terms of what one operator contributed under those conditions." She looked at the file again. "I'll open the surveillance phase. You'll stay available for consultation." "Yes," Ava said. "Good." Ewan stood, looked at Walker. "Keep your team off Doss until I tell you otherwise. No behavioral changes, no altered access patterns. Nothing that indicates anyone in this command is looking at him differently." "Can you do that?" Walker's jaw tightened. "Yes. It's going to require you to interact with him normally." "I understand." Ewan looked at him for a moment. "Commander Walker, in my experience, the hardest part of a counterintelligence investigation for the people closest to the suspect is the performance requirement. You're going to have to sit across from Raymond Doss in a planning meeting and treat him exactly the way you treated him yesterday, knowing what you know now. That is significantly harder than it sounds." Walker met her eyes. "What's the alternative?" "There isn't one," Ewan said. "That's why I'm telling you how hard it is. Not to give you an out, to give you accurate expectations." She left. The operations center was quiet. Kowalski, who had been standing near the back wall throughout the NCIS meeting, exhaled slowly. "So we wait." "We wait," Walker confirmed. Reed looked at Ava. "How long do you think the surveillance phase runs before they have something actionable?" "Depends on whether Doss is still actively passing information or whether this operation was a contained run that he's already closing down. If he's closing down, they might have weeks. If he's still active—" She paused. "NCIS is good. They'll move when they have enough." Reed nodded. Then he said quietly, and without any of the performance that had been in his manner when she first walked into the briefing room, "Lieutenant Bennett, I need to say something to you." She looked at him. "In the briefing room yesterday morning when Commander Walker said what he said." Reed stopped, started again. "I didn't agree with him. I want to be precise about that. I didn't think what he said was fair or accurate, but I also didn't say anything, and that's on me." She waited. "I told myself I was staying out of a command dynamic that wasn't my place to interfere in. That's true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough. Because the result of me staying out of it was that you went into an already complicated operational environment, carrying the weight of a commander who had publicly dismissed you, and that's a weight no operator should carry on a mission. And I could have reduced it, and I chose not to." The operations center was very still. Ava looked at Reed for a moment. "Senior Chief," she said. "You covered my flank on the ridge sniper. When Kowalski put suppression on that depression, that was your call, not Walker's. You assessed the situation and gave Kowalski the direction before Walker could process the request." Reed said nothing. "I heard it on the radio," she said. "The sequence. You moved faster than the command chain because you understood what I needed and you made the call." She paused. "That's not the action of someone who didn't have my back." Reed looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You shouldn't have needed to earn it." "No," she said. "I shouldn't have. But that's a conversation for a different room on a different day. Right now, I need coffee and a chair and about 4 hours of silence before the formal debrief." Something shifted in Reed's expression. The specific shift of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has been given permission carefully and without drama to set it down without making the setting down into a larger ceremony than the moment required. "Coffee I can do," he said. He brought her the 2 cups he'd set down earlier, which had gone cold, and went and found fresh ones without being asked. The formal debrief ran from 1530 to 1900. 4 hours with a rotating cast of personnel, the mission planning officer, the intelligence officer, 2 officers from the group, 7 command structure, and finally near the end, a full admiral who had flown in from the regional headquarters and who sat at the back of the debrief room and said nothing for 3 hours until he said everything. Admiral James Croft was 61 years old, had spent 40 years in naval special warfare, and had the particular quality of senior commanders who had accumulated enough genuine experience that the performance layer most senior officers developed had simply worn away. He didn't need to perform authority. He had it the way old structures had weight, not because they announced it, but because it was in the materials. He had sat at the back of the debrief room and listened to the entire reconstruction of the operation, the intelligence assessment failures, the approach route, compromise, the mountain engagement, the hostage recovery, the counterintelligence, identification. And when the debrief concluded and the room began to empty, he said, "Lieutenant Bennett, stay." Everyone else filed out. Walker paused at the door. "You too, Commander," Croft said. Walker came back in. Croft looked at Ava for a moment. Just looked. The assessment of a man who has been evaluating operators for 4 decades. "Walk me through the shot at 1800 meters, he said. She walked him through it. The calculation, the variables, the firing solution, the decision to take the shot rather than report and defer, and the reasoning behind that decision, the timeline, the relay function, the consequences of a transmitted report reaching an external command element. Croft listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I've been in this community for 40 years. I've seen 2 shots at that range in operational conditions. One of them required 3 attempts. The other was made by a master sergeant who subsequently became the command's primary long-range precision training instructor." He paused. "How long have you been shooting?" 16 years. "Who trained you initially?" "My father, retired Master Sergeant William Bennett, USMC. Something moved in Croft's expression. A recognition. "William Bennett, Oceanside." "Yes, sir." "I know your father's record," Croft said. "I didn't know he had a daughter in the community." He was quiet for a moment. "He trained you well." "He trained me everything," she said. "The rest I built on what he gave me." Croft looked at Walker. "Commander Walker, your assessment of Lieutenant Bennett's performance." Walker didn't hesitate. "The best operational performance I have observed from a single operator in 15 years, including myself." He paused. "I also failed to properly assess and utilize that capability at the beginning of this operation, and that failure created significant additional risk for my team. That's on my record, and I'm not asking for any adjustment of it." Croft looked at him for a moment. "The NCIS referral," he said. "You put your name on it." "Yes, sir. And you're confident in the analysis." "I'm confident in Lieutenant Bennett's analysis," Walker said, "which is the same thing." Croft was quiet for a moment. Then he said to Ava, There's a position opening in the command's Advanced Capability Development Program, Sniper Methodology and Precision Fires Doctrine for Group 7 and affiliated units. It has been vacant for 8 months because we have not identified a candidate who meets the full qualification profile. He paused. I'm identifying one now. Ava looked at him. That's a standing offer, Croft said. Take your time. Finish your current assignment. But the offer is open. He stood, picked up his cover, looked at Walker one more time. Commander, 15 years of distinguished performance. One significant assessment failure that your team survived entirely because of the capability you failed to properly assess. He held Walker's eyes. Learn from it. Don't let it define you. The community needs commanders who have learned this lesson, not commanders who are still carrying the weight of it. He walked out. The debrief room was empty except for Walker and Ava. Walker looked at the closed door for a moment. Then he looked at her. I almost got 11 people killed, he said. Not for Croft, who was gone. Not for the record. Just saying it out loud in the particular way that people said the things they needed to hear themselves say in order to fully process them. Almost, she said. That's a thin margin. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at her. How do you do that? He asked. Walk into a room where everyone has already decided who you are and just work. Like the weight of it doesn't exist. She thought about that. It exists, she said. I just decided a long time ago that it was their weight to carry, not mine. My job is to do the work. The work doesn't care what anyone assumed before I did it. Walker was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father told you that. He told me half of it. The other half I figured out on my own. He almost smiled. Get some sleep, Lieutenant, he said. The surveillance operation is going to generate follow-up requirements, and NCIS is going to want you accessible. She stood, moved toward the door. Walker, she said without turning. Yeah. The offer from Admiral Croft, the doctrine position. She paused. I'm going to think about it. You should take it, he said. I know, she said. I just like to think first. She walked out. Behind her in the empty debrief, Commander Ethan Walker sat down in a chair and looked at the table where the mission documentation was spread out and thought about a girl he had laughed at in a briefing room 20 hours ago, and what that laugh had cost and what it had failed to cost because of the person he had been laughing at. He sat with that for a long time. And the thing that happened in him while he sat there was not guilt. Exactly. Guilt would have been easier, and he was not a man who took the easier path when he recognized it as easier. What happened in him was something harder and more permanent. It was understanding. And understanding, unlike guilt, didn't fade. It stayed. It changed the shape of what came after. And in the operations center down the corridor, NCIS Special Agent Patricia Ewan was already running the first phase of surveillance on a Master Chief Petty Officer who had spent 6 years building trust. He had spent 6 years betraying, and the thread that Ava Bennett had found in a mission access log was beginning to unspool, and on a mountain. Somewhere behind all of them, the terrain that had tried to consume Walker's team was empty and cold and indifferent, the way terrain always was, without memory and without apology. The mountain didn't care what happened on it. The people on it cared. And one of them who had started the night as the person nobody wanted in the briefing room had changed everything. Not because she had needed to prove something, because the work had needed to be done, and she was the one who could do it. The surveillance operation had 12 days to run before Raymond Doss made the mistake that closed the case. But that was a story for the morning that was still coming. This night was finished. And it had ended with everyone alive. Part 5. Lưu ý viết 5 chèn điền bên trăm từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 5 đặt điểm 10/10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh sửa lời AI. Kẻ theo ngôi thứ ba giữ độ kịch tính không viết lăn màn. Kết thúc dùng câu khẳng định mạnh để khép lại câu chuyện rõ ràng, trọn vẹn. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mục document mới. 2-3 phút, cần có mini climax và đạt 10-15 mini climax mời. Phần cữ 10-12 phút, có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn. Tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8-10 phút, cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh, và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Show more part 5 what the work proves. The surveillance operation ran 12 days. Ava knew this, not because NCIS kept her informed in real time. They didn't, and she hadn't expected them to. But because on the morning of the 13th day, Patricia Ewan walked into the Iron Valley Operations Building at 0730 with the particular quality of controlled satisfaction that experienced investigators carried when a case had closed the way a case was supposed to close. Not celebration. Something quieter and more durable than celebration. The satisfaction of a conclusion that the evidence had earned. Ava was at a workstation running imagery analysis on a separate tasking when Ewan found her. She had spent the 12 days of the surveillance operation doing what she always did when she was waiting for something she couldn't control. She worked. She completed her mission documentation. She ran the formal after-action analysis that the Group 7 command structure required. She answered NCIS's follow-up questions when they came, which they did twice in the first week. And she gave them everything she had with the same precision she gave everything. She also, in the spaces between the formal requirements, went back to the original mission imagery and rebuilt the complete intelligence picture from scratch. Not because she had missed something the first time. Because the habit of reconstruction of taking an analysis she had already completed and running it again from zero to see if the conclusion held was the habit that kept her honest about her own work. The most dangerous moment in any analysis was the moment you stopped questioning your own conclusions because you had already committed to them. The reconstruction confirmed everything. And it added one detail she hadn't fully developed during the mission itself. A small thread in the imagery pattern that when she pulled it extended the picture of Doss's intelligence activity further back than she had initially estimated. Not 6 months, closer to 14. She had passed that detail to Ewan on day 4 of the surveillance operation, and Ewan had said, "That's consistent with what we're developing." And nothing else, which told Ava the surveillance was generating material and the case was building. On day 13, Ewan sat down across from her and said, "Raymond Doss was arrested this morning at 0615, at his residence. He was in the process of destroying a communications device when the arrest team came through the door. He didn't complete the destruction. The device has material on it." Ava set down what she was working on. "How much material?" "Enough," Ewan said. 14 months of contact records, handler communications, payment confirmations, a complete operational log that he maintained himself, which is either a profound arrogance or a profound stupidity, and in my experience, it's usually both. What was the access point? How did they recruit him? Ewan looked at her for a moment. That's still being developed, but the preliminary picture is financial. Doss had a debt structure that created leverage, and someone found the leverage and used it. She paused. It's almost always financial at the beginning. The ideology comes later, if it comes at all. Most of the time it's just money, and then the money creates a commitment that becomes its own trap. Ava absorbed that. The weight of it was specific, not abstract, not institutional, but personal in the way that betrayal by proximity always was. Doss had sat in planning sessions with Walker's team for 6 years. He had eaten in the same cafeteria, walked the same corridors, attended the same after-action reviews. He had learned over 14 months of active intelligence passing, which missions to compromise, and how to compromise them in ways that looked like operational bad luck rather than deliberate sabotage. "How many operations?" she asked. Ewan's expression answered the question before her words did. "We're still counting. The 14 months of records need to be cross-referenced against the Group 7 operation log. It's going to take time." She paused. "More than this operation." The weight of that settled in the room. "Walker needs to know," Ava said. "Walker has already been notified. The Group 7 command structure has been notified. Admiral Croft has been briefed. Ewan looked at her. You're the last person I'm informing directly, which should tell you something about the sequence of priority. Ava said nothing. The referral you made, Ewan said, on the morning after the mission, running on 12 hours without sleep after an 8-hour mountain operation. The evidentiary framework you built from an access log and a hostage interview and imagery analysis was the cleanest, most structurally sound preliminary counterintelligence referral I have seen in 20 years of this work. She said it the way she said everything, precisely without decoration, as a factual assessment rather than a compliment. I want you to understand that, not because you need the validation, because the record should reflect what actually happened. Ava looked at her. Thank you, she said. Ewan nodded once, stood, moved toward the door, then stopped. The offer from Admiral Croft, she said without turning. The doctrine position. I'm aware of it. Take it, Ewan said. Not because it's a reward, because the methodology you used on this operation, the way you build an intelligence picture from fragmented evidence, the way you integrate precision fires with real-time tactical analysis, that's not something that should stay in one operator's head. It should be doctrine. She paused. Think about it. She walked out. Ava sat with the empty workstation for a moment. Then she picked up what she had been working on and continued. Walker called a team meeting at 1000, not a formal debrief, not a command briefing. He used the word meeting deliberately, and the operators who filed into the room understood the distinction. A meeting was a different category of conversation than a debrief. A debrief was institutional. It served the record, the assessment process, the organizational requirement to convert experience into documentation. A meeting was personal. A meeting was Walker choosing to say something to his team rather than to the record. They came in without ceremony. Kowalski, Reed, the 7 other operators who had been on the mountain. They found chairs or leaned against walls with the easy physicality of people accustomed to occupying space without fuss. Ava sat in the back. Walker stood at the front of the room and looked at his team for a moment before he spoke. Not performing the pause. He didn't do things for performance. It wasn't his nature, but actually using the time to look at the people in front of him. The people who had been on a mountain with him 13 days ago and had come back. Raymond Doss was arrested this morning, he said. No preamble, no framing, just the fact delivered cleanly. The room absorbed it. Kowalski looked at the floor. Reed looked at his hands. One of the newer operators, a petty officer second class named Garrett, who had been on his 3rd operational deployment and had not yet accumulated enough scar tissue to manage this kind of information without it showing, made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word. 14 months. Walker continued. Preliminary assessment is 14 months of active intelligence passing. The full cross-reference against our operation log is ongoing. He paused. Some of the missions during that period that we assessed as operationally difficult may turn out to have been operationally compromised. We won't know the complete picture for some time. Reed said very quietly, How many of us went out on compromised operations? We don't know yet. People could have died. Yes, Walker said. They could have. The room was very still. Then Reed said, We need to talk about how this happened. Not the how of Doss's recruitment. The how of 6 years and none of us seeing it. Walker nodded. That's why we're here. What followed was not a comfortable conversation. It was the kind of conversation that groups of people who trust each other have when something has happened that challenges the foundation of that trust. Not the trust between them, but the trust in the institutional environment that surrounded them. The trust that the people beside you in a planning room were what they appeared to be. The trust that the information you were building operations on was clean. The trust that the access controls and the verification systems and the institutional safeguards that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of penetration were actually working. Kowalski said, I sat next to the man in briefings for 3 years, and I never questioned anything, not once. That bothers me more than the fact that he was dirty, the fact that I never questioned it. None of us questioned it, Reed said. Should we have silence? Walker said, That's the question that matters. And the honest answer is probably not individually, probably yes, institutionally. One person not questioning a trusted colleague with a clean record is normal. A system that creates no mechanism for random verification of personnel with sustained deep access is a gap. That gap exists. DOS used it. He paused. NCIS is making recommendations to the command structure about access verification protocols. Those recommendations are going to change how this command operates. Good, Kowalski said. Simply, without elaboration, it was the right word. Garrett, the newest operator, looked up from the floor at that word, and something in his expression shifted the shift of someone who had been expecting a more complicated response and had received instead the straightforward pragmatism that experienced operators developed around things they couldn't change. The past was the past. The gap existed. The gap was being addressed. Move forward. Walker looked at the back of the room, at Ava. There's something else this team needs to address, he said, and it's not about DOS. The room shifted. Everyone who had been looking at Walker, or at the floor, or at their hands, found their way to Ava, because Walker was looking at Ava, and Walker's team had spent the last 13 days recalibrating around what she had done on the mountain, and they knew what was coming, and they knew it was overdue. Lieutenant Bennett identified the approach compromise before we left the wire, Walker said. She presented evidence. I dismissed it. I dismissed it not because the evidence was weak. The evidence as she presented it was sufficient to justify at minimum a pause and additional assessment. But because I had already decided before she opened her mouth what the value of her input was going to be. He held her eyes from across the room. That decision was wrong. It was operationally wrong, and it was personally wrong, and it created a situation on that mountain that 11 people survived because Lieutenant Bennett is exceptional at her job. If she had been less than exceptional, some of those 11 people would not have come back. The room was completely quiet. I've put that in my formal after-action assessment, Walker continued, accurately and without mitigation. The command structure has that record. Admiral Croft has that record. He paused. But the record isn't what matters most to me right now. What matters most is that the people in this room understand what happened and why it happened and what we're going to do differently. Reed said, "What are we going to do differently?" Walker said, "We're going to evaluate capability before we evaluate anything else. We're going to look at what someone can do before we decide what their input is worth. And we're going to build a team culture where the newest person in the room can tell the most experienced person in the room that they're wrong, and that experienced person is going to listen." He paused. "Not because we're required to, because we've seen what happens when we don't." Kowalski looked at Ava, direct, unadorned. "I laughed," he said. "In the briefing room when Commander Walker made his comment. I smiled. I want to say that directly. I'm not going to dress it up as something more complicated than it was. I thought it was funny, and it wasn't funny, and I'm sorry." Ava looked at him. "Kowalski," she said. "You put suppression on that ridge sniper at exactly the right moment, at exactly the right pace, without a target to range. You gave me the window I needed. We're even." Kowalski held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting something he knew he didn't fully deserve, and accepting it anyway, because the person offering it had chosen grace over accounting, and the only appropriate response to that was to receive it with the same directness with which it was offered. Garrett, the youngest operator who had been quiet through the entire conversation, said, "Lieutenant Bennett, can I ask you something?" She looked at him. "How do you do it, the waiting? The being dismissed and then having to perform anyway? I've been in this community for 3 years, and I've watched it happen to people, and I've never figured out how you carry it without it affecting your performance." The room waited. Ava looked at Garrett for a moment. He was 26 years old, she estimated. Younger than her by enough that the question came from a place of genuine uncertainty rather than challenge. He was asking because he wanted to know, and the wanting was real. "You carry it by being honest about what it actually is," she said. "It's not about you. The dismissal, the assumption, the laugh in the briefing room, none of that is about your capability. It's about the person doing the dismissing and what they brought into the room before you arrived. Their assumptions are not your problem to solve, and they're not your weight to carry. Your only job is the work. Do the work. Let the work be the answer. She paused. You don't fight the assumption. You don't perform against it. You just work, and eventually the work is all that's left. Garrett absorbed that. Your father told you that, he said. She almost smiled. Walker had said the same thing 13 days ago. He told me the first half, she said. The second half took longer. She found Walker after the meeting. Not because she had sought him out, she had been moving toward the exit when he appeared beside her, falling into step with the quiet purposefulness of a man who had decided what he needed to say and was saying it before he thought himself out of it. I submitted the formal recommendation for the doctrine position this morning, he said. She looked at him. I wasn't asked to, he said. Croft made the offer. I submitted a formal endorsement on my own initiative. Full operational record attached. Complete mission documentation from the Iron Valley operation. He paused. The counterintelligence identification. All of it. Walker, it's a position that should have someone like you in it, he said. The methodology you used on that mountain, the way you build a tactical picture, the way you integrate Overwatch with real-time intelligence analysis, that's not in our doctrine. It should be. And the only way it gets into the doctrine is if the person who understands it best is the person writing it. He looked at her. I was wrong about you in the briefing room. I can't undo that. But I can make sure that what you actually are gets the platform it deserves. That's something I can do. She looked at him for a long moment. I was going to take the position anyway, she said. Something moved in his expression. Relief, maybe. Or the particular quality of a man who had done something right and was acknowledging to himself that it was right. I know, he said. I wanted to be on the record as someone who believed it before you made the decision official. She looked at him. You know what's interesting, she said. What? In the briefing room, you said I still needed to prove I belonged here. But I've been thinking about that phrase for 13 days, and I've realized I never needed to prove I belonged here. The only thing that needed proving was what I could do. And I would have done the same work regardless of whether you believed it or not. The work doesn't change based on who's watching. Walker was quiet. That's the difference, she said, between people who perform for validation and people who work toward a standard. The standard doesn't move. The validation is just noise. He looked at her for a long moment. Your father, he said. My father, she confirmed, and 16 years of practice. 3 weeks after the DOS arrest, the Group 7 command structure held a formal review of the Iron Valley operation. It was not the kind of review that happened after successful missions, the routine after-action processing that generated documentation and moved on. It was a deeper assessment convened by Admiral Croft, attended by the Group 7 leadership and 2 senior officers from Naval Special Warfare Command. A review of what the operation had revealed about the command's intelligence security protocols, personnel assessment processes, and operational decision-making framework. Ava was asked to present her methodology. Not the shots. Not the tactical engagement sequence. The methodology. The analytical process she had used to build the threat picture from the imagery, to identify the approach compromise, to locate the blocking element, to develop the counterintelligence referral. The thinking behind the work. She stood at the front of the room and presented it for 40 minutes without notes. The room listened with the particular quality of attention that exists when people who are very experienced at their work are encountering something that is simultaneously within their professional framework and beyond what they expected to find there. When she finished, one of the senior Warcom officers said, Lieutenant Bennett, in your assessment, what is the primary failure mode in the pre-mission intelligence review process that allowed the approach compromise to go undetected? She knew the answer before the question was fully formed. Confirmation bias in imagery analysis, she said. The analysts saw what the timeline suggested they would see. The imagery was assessed against a framework that had already concluded the approach was viable, which meant evidence that contradicted that conclusion was processed as anomaly rather than signal. The vehicle tracks I identified were in the imagery. They were not flagged because the assessment framework had already decided what the imagery should show. And how do you correct for that? You build adversarial analysis into the assessment protocol. You require a second analyst to approach the imagery with the explicit mandate to disprove the primary assessment's conclusions. You treat the analytical product as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a conclusion to be verified. She paused. It's slower. It generates disagreement. Commanders don't always like it because it introduces uncertainty into a planning process that prefers clean answers, but it catches the things that confirmation bias buries. Admiral Croft from the back of the room. How long would that have added to the Iron Valley planning phase? 36 hours minimum, possibly 72. And in your assessment, what would 36 hours of adversarial imagery analysis have produced in this specific case? She met his eyes. It would have flagged the vehicle track pattern that identified the approach compromise. It would have identified the secondary structure as a possible alternative hostage location. It would have changed the mission fundamentally before the first operator stepped off the wire. She paused. David Rice would have come home 2 days earlier, and the mountain wouldn't have been necessary. The room was very quiet. Croft said, "Write it up. Formal methodology document. I want it on my desk in 30 days. Yes, sir? Not a recommendation memo, a doctrine draft, specific enough to implement. Understood." He looked at her for a moment. Your father was a good Marine, he said. He produced a better analyst. She didn't correct him. She knew what her father would say about being called a Marine by an admiral, and she knew what he would say about the comparison, and both of those things made her want to smile in a way she kept contained, professional, appropriate to the room. I'll tell him you said so, she said. She called her father that evening. He picked up on the second ring, which he always did. Retired Master Sergeant William Bennett maintained the same operational readiness with his personal communications that he had maintained with everything else, because habits formed over 22 years didn't dissolve because a knee gave out in the Mojave. Ava. His voice. The same voice it had always been, not warm in the conventional sense, not soft, but present in a way that was its own kind of warmth. Solid and reliable. The way certain kinds of ground were solid and reliable. The kind you didn't question when you put your weight on it. Dad? How are you? I'm good, she said. And she meant it with a precision that the word didn't always carry. She was genuinely, specifically good. Not fine, not managing, not getting through, but actually well in the way that came from having done difficult work correctly. Tell me, he said. So she told him. Not all of it, the classified elements. She couldn't share the operational specifics that belonged to the mission record rather than a phone call. But the shape of it. The briefing room. The laugh. The mountain. The work. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a short silence. Then he said, Walker. Yes. He came around. He did. On the mountain. Yes. Another short silence. Good, her father said. That's the best version of it. A man who learns it under pressure and carries it after. That's worth something. I know, she said. The doctrine position. I'm taking it. She heard him exhale. Not with relief, he had never doubted she would find her way to whatever position matched her capability, because he had built the capability, and he knew what it was worth. The exhale was something else. Something quieter and more internal. The particular sound of a man who had given someone the best of what he had, and was recognizing in the distance between then and now that it had been enough. Write the methodology correctly, he said. Don't simplify it for the room. Write it for operators who are capable of handling the full version and trust them to be capable. I will. And Ava. Yeah. The laugh in the briefing room. He said it without softness, but also without hardness. Just exactly what it was. You know what it means when someone laughs at what you are before you show them what you can do. I know. Tell me anyway. She paused. It means they're not ready yet, she said. It means the assumption is still bigger than the evidence. And the only thing that changes that is the work. Yes, he said. You told me that when I was 9 years old. You believed me when you were 9 years old, he said. That was the part that mattered. The doctrine document took 28 days. She wrote it the way he had told her to, full version, no simplification, trusting the operators who would use it to be capable of handling the complexity. She wrote the adversarial analysis protocol in enough detail that a mission planning team with no prior exposure to the methodology could implement it from the document alone. She wrote the imagery assessment framework, the timeline correlation process, the access log analysis sequence she had used to identify DOS. She wrote it all, and at the end in the final section, she wrote something that was not standard doctrine language. She wrote it anyway, because Croft had asked for a doctrine draft rather than a recommendation memo. And the difference between the two was the difference between what you could implement and what you needed to believe in order to implement it correctly. She wrote, "The fundamental failure mode in high-stakes intelligence assessment is not analytical error. It is the decision made before analysis begins about whose analysis is worth trusting. The most sophisticated assessment methodology in the world fails if the commander running the mission has already decided based on criteria unrelated to capability, which inputs deserve consideration. Doctrine cannot fully correct for this failure because doctrine operates at the level of process, and this failure operates at the level of assumption. What doctrine can do is create structural requirements for multiple analytical perspectives so that the failure of any single assumption is mitigated by the presence of competing conclusions. The goal is not to eliminate human judgment. The goal is to ensure that human judgment operates on the full available evidence rather than the evidence that confirms what was already believed." She submitted it on day 28. Croft's response came back in 4 hours. 3 words. "This is right." The morning she left Iron Valley Base to begin the doctrine position at the Group 7 training facility, Walker was waiting outside the operations building. She had not told him she was leaving that morning. He had found out the same way he found out operational information through the network of people and communications that kept a military command aware of its own movements, and he had decided to be there. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked at the cups. "One of those is mine," she asked. "Reed suggested it," he said. "I would have thought of it myself eventually." She took the cup. They stood outside the building in the early morning with the coffee and the particular quality of light that existed at Iron Valley at that hour, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the silence was entirely different from every silence they had shared before the mountain. Before the mountain, the silences had been tactical, strategic, managed, each of them reading the other for advantage or disadvantage. This silence was just silence. 2 people who had been through something difficult together. Standing in the morning with coffee, not needing to fill the air with words, because the words had already been said, and what remained was the straightforward human fact of shared experience. "Kowalski wants to know if he can reach out to you during the doctrine development," Walker said finally. "He has thoughts about the sniper integration piece. Tell him to email me. He was afraid you'd say no." "Why would I say no?" Walker almost smiled. "He's not sure he's earned the reach out yet." "Tell him the suppression call earned it," she said. "He'll understand." Walker nodded, looked at his coffee for a moment. "The next mission we run," he said. "The first thing I'm going to do in the planning room is ask what we might be wrong about. Not rhetorically. Actually ask. I'm going to make it a standing requirement." "Good," she said. "I learned that from someone." "I know you did," she said. He looked at her. "Lieutenant Bennett." He said her name the same way he had said it in the briefing room, the same name, the same voice, but the weight behind it was entirely different now. Not a formality, not a management device. Her actual name said by someone who understood what it was attached to. Whatever the next thing is, whatever comes after the doctrine position, whatever mission or assignment or role is next. I hope the people in the room are smart enough to listen before the mountain has to teach them. She looked at him. "Some of them will be," she said. "And the ones who aren't, that's what the doctrine is for." She finished the coffee, set the cup on the railing beside the door, picked up her bag, walked toward the vehicle that was waiting. Behind her, Walker watched her go with the expression of a commander who had learned the most important lesson of his career from the person he had laughed at in a briefing room, and who understood clearly, and without any remaining ambiguity, the full cost of the 16 hours between the laugh and the understanding. He didn't call after her. She didn't look back. She had work to do. The doctrine document was submitted. The DOS case was in NCIS's hands. Walker's team was intact, and the hostage was home, and the mountain was behind all of them. And somewhere in Oceanside, a retired Marine Master Sergeant was waiting for his daughter to call and tell him that the methodology he had built her on patience precision, the absolute refusal to let anyone else's assumption become her. Sealing had done what he had always known it would do when she carried it into the right room at the right moment. It had changed everything. Not loudly, not with announcement. The way the best work always changed everything, through the quiet, permanent, undeniable accumulation of what was true. Ava Bennett had walked into a briefing room where nobody wanted her. She had walked out of a mountain where nobody could have done without her. And the distance between those two facts was the only proof that had ever mattered. The work had spoken, and it had spoken in a voice no one in that room would ever